Chapter 96. After gradually calming down, Ning-Kei stared at the ink words on the paper in a daze, silently wondering who had left these words on the paper. Who was it that was answering his questions? Who was secretly helping him? Why did he do this? He quietly turned his head to the east window. The female professor was still calmly writing regular script and did not notice him at all. Ning-Kei looked at the plain figure of the professor and thought of the extremely disrespectful explanation on the back of the paper. He subconsciously shook his head. It was impossible for such filthy words to be written by the female professor. Could it be the teacher in charge of the old library downstairs? Ning-Kei frowned and thought about this question. Finally, he gently shook his head. Although the teacher in charge was humorous, he could see that he was a person who strictly abided by the rules. If he wanted to instruct Ning-Kei, he would have said it face to face instead of choosing to leave a letter. After thinking about it, Ning-Kei still could not figure out who left the letter on the paper. He confusedly looked out of the window and listened to the chirping of the male insects in the depths of the woods and grass. Then he laughed at himself and thought that the person who left the letter was probably an old and dirty teacher in charge of the academy. If Situ Ilan and others saw these words, they would definitely jump up in anger. The words in the letter combined the way of reading books with the attitude towards women. Although it was obscene, it was extremely simple and easy to understand. Otherwise, Ning-Kei could not have realized that he might have learned something from it in such a short time. In his view, the person who left the letter deliberately used this method to enlighten him. As the saying goes, seek the way from the filth. He could not help but admire this person to the extreme. He silently thought that the person who left the letter must be a cultivation genius. Since he was sure that the person who left the letter was a cultivation genius of the academy, Ning-Kei naturally became more serious. He picked up the primary exploration of the Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow and that thin paper, walked to the end of the bookshelf and sat down on the floor warmly illuminated by the sunset. After holding his breath and calming himself down for a moment, he began to read the letter again. Chan Pippi had obviously underestimated the poor Ning-Kei's comprehension ability. Even if he did not write the last two paragraphs and did not explain it with an extreme attitude towards women, Ning-Kei would still be able to understand the true meaning of what he wanted to express with the first few sentences about objective facts and understanding. Don't understand, don't think, just look at the text itself. Is this the original intention of the divine talisman master of the academy? What I need to do is to look at these words and not think about the meaning of these words. Ning-Kei looked at the thin book on his knees and thought silently for a long time. These days, he had been reading the books in the building at the expense of his spirit. He was very clear about the impact those words had on his spiritual world. Comparing the two, he increasingly felt that the method of reading books suggested by the writer was worth a try. It was just that when you saw a word or phrase that you knew by heart, you had to not think about it. You had to pretend that you didn't know the meaning of the word or phrase. You didn't even have to pretend. You really wanted to forget the meaning of the word or phrase. No matter how you looked at it, it was extremely difficult. There was a big locust tree outside the courtyard that accompanied you through your childhood and adolescence. When you saw this big locust tree today, you had to pretend that you had never seen it before. You had to pretend that you didn't know it was a big locust tree. You had to forget that it was the big locust tree that accompanied you for countless years and witnessed your naughtiness and even your first love and first kiss. Who could do that? Ning-Kei did not open the thin book on his knees. He stared at the thin paper beside the book in a daze. His mind had drifted out of the window to somewhere else. He was thinking hard about how to forget the meaning of the words he saw. To forget all the words I know. How can I do that? The sunlight outside the west window shone on his frowning eyebrows, giving off a faint luster. Suddenly, the tip of his eyebrows slightly raised and a flash of light flashed in Ning-Kei's eyes. At this moment, he remembered the word he had written many years ago when he first came into contact with calligraphy. He remembered the word he had written countless times with a brush and a branch over the years. The word Yong. For anyone who had received ordinary calligraphy training, the word Yong would always be the most familiar word to them. In the Eastern Jin dynasty in that world, Mr. Wang Shiji, the most vigorous calligrapher in history, thought that the 8 strokes of calligraphy of Yong was just like the 8 skills of regular script. As the saying went, the point was the side, the horizontal was the restrain, the vertical was the crossbow, the hook was the leap, the lift was the tack, the skim was the sweep, the short skim was the peck, and the restrain was the chew. This was the famous 8 skills of calligraphy of Yong. Ning Kei's eyes became brighter and brighter. A word Yong could basically form any word in the world if it was broken apart and reassembled. Then if he used the 8 skills of calligraphy of Yong to look at it again, would he be able to recognize all the words as the word Yong? He was very clear that this was not a wise or even a smart method. It was just a stupid method, and no one knew whether this method could be used or not. However, he could not suppress his inner desire and impulse at this time. After taking a deep breath, he did not hesitate to open the first page of the primary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. Heaven and earth breathe, which is called breath. Ning Kei stared at the word Tian at the beginning of the first sentence of the book. To be more precise, he did not see the whole word in his eyes, only the first stroke of the word Tian, a flat horizontal line. It was as if a sharp knife had drawn in the dark spiritual world. With a hissing sound, a faint white light seeped out from the tiny gap. Then, a second stroke of thick ink appeared in his eyes, followed by an indifferent long stroke, and finally a downward stroke. The full and complete word Tian on the page of the book appeared successively in his eyes and in his mind in this way of deconstruction. However, it could not form a complete meaning. There was a word in his eyes, but he was only allowed to see the strokes, and was not allowed to assemble it in his mind. Sounded simple, but it was extremely difficult to do. It was definitely not something that ordinary people could do. Fortunately, Ning Kei had painstakingly practiced calligraphy for nearly 20 years, and disassembling words had already become a kind of instinct. However, calligraphers required that every stroke should be finished first, and then the framework should be reconstructed. Now, he had forcibly cut off the most important part in his mind. If his spiritual instinct required him to assemble those strokes, the word Yong in his mind would begin to play an important role, and he would interpret it as a part of the word Yong instead of a part of the word Tian. Even for him, it was extremely difficult to treat the unreal as the real thing. At this time, he had concentrated all his spirit, and his hands holding the book were slightly trembling. The back of his school robe was already wet with sweat. His eyelashes kept blinking painfully, and his lips were tightly pressed together, as if he had licked the tip of a pen for the first time in his childhood. This time, after the ink words in the book entered his eyes, they finally did not become blurred like countless times in the past, and then became blobs of ink, and then floated away from the paper and began to vibrate in his mind. Instead, they appeared extremely clearly and slowly in his field of vision, as quiet and tame as the leaves floating on the windless lake. At this moment, Ning Kei had completely forgotten how he had been tortured by these words. He just quietly looked at the strokes and the momentum of each stroke. It was as if he was looking at the surface of the lake under the breeze, and the leaves slowly drifting to the east and west, or drifting close to him. There was no wind and waves, no rainstorm in Spring Breeze Pavilion, and no pack of wolves on the grassland. He slightly drooped his eyelids and sat cross-legged on the floor at the end of the bookshelf in the warm afternoon sunshine. His trembling hands no longer trembled, his tense body gradually relaxed, and his tightly pressed lips gradually relaxed. He did not faint, or vomit, only calmness. The rise and fall of the wind were always gentle and graceful. The insects in the depths of the woods outside the building once again began to sing cheerfully, celebrating this happy spring day, celebrating the appearance of a new and interesting world in front of him. The gentle spring wind wrapped these songs and floated into the window, rippling in the empty and quiet space of the old library. Occasionally, it fell on the lad, gently brushing his clothes. The front of his school robe slightly trembled, as if some invisible force was slowly flowing inside. The traces on the front of the school robe did not flow smoothly and smoothly. Every time it reached a certain place on the chest and abdomen, it would quietly turn back, like the waves on the lake raised by the spring wind, pushing the leaves on the water to scatter around. Finally, it would touch the lakeside stone wall and silently turn back, unable to reach the shore or break the shore. At this time, the female professor by the east window seemed to sense something and slightly frowned. She raised her face and quietly listened to the insects outside the window and the movement of the spring wind. Then she turned her head to look at the lad under the west window and smiled slightly. It's called she. When Ninkei saw the word she, suddenly his mind was slightly distracted and his eyes subconsciously left the book. The whole word she came directly into his eyes with its complete structure. With a splash, a naughty shepherd boy threw a stone into the small lake. The water rippled slightly and the swaying leaves became chaotic. He only felt a buzz in his mind and suddenly became sober. Although he had experienced it many times, the word she still brought a great shock to his spiritual world. He groaned and stretched out his right hand at lightning speed to support his body on the wooden floor. He forced himself to turn his head and did not dare to look at any of the words in the book. His face was extremely pale. Even so, there was an irrepressible smile on his pale face at this time because he knew that he did see the door. Although it was not necessarily the door that the writer wanted to open for him, at least he did not faint after he opened the door. Moreover, he had a faint feeling that if he continued to read in this way, regardless of whether he could see the wonders of the cultivation world or not, it would be of great benefit to the art of calligraphy. He did not rush to stand up, but continued to sit cross-legged under the sun. He closed his eyes and began to recall the previous feeling, trying to find the strokes in the depths of his mind and the leaves that dissipated on the surface of the lake. After an unknown amount of time, he opened his eyes and smiled. Standing up, he walked to the table by the west window and picked up the brush and a new piece of paper. After a moment of contemplation, he began to write a reply to the person who had left the message. In the reply, he first sincerely thanked the writer for his guidance, and then wrote his solution and doubts very frankly. He asked the writer to comment on whether it was feasible or not. Finally, he very solemnly asked for advice. When reading the book and meditating, I seem to see the movement of the leaves in the lake. Is that the original intention of the divine talisman master's strokes? I saw that the traces of the leaves in the lake were scattered, but indistinctly followed a pattern. I seem to feel it in the ocean of chi in my chest and abdomen. Is that psyche power? Oh. Chapter 97. Ninkei held the two corners of the paper with his fingers and stretched it to the window. The warm sun and spring breeze outside quickly dried the ink. After confirming that there was no problem, he carefully folded the paper and put it back into the book in the same position as before. He stood up and put the book in its usual position on the bookshelf. Then he walked to the east window and bowed to the female professor respectfully. The female professor nodded slightly in return. Then he should go downstairs directly, but in the process of straightening up, he suddenly thought of something. He thought that this female professor must be a great figure in the academy since she had been practicing regular script in the old library for several years. Moreover, she seemed to be quiet and kind. Since the writer was willing to help him, maybe she would also be willing to help him? As a poor lad who had more than 2,000 taels of silver, Ninkei thought about it and felt that he could not let go of such an opportunity. After a short pause he said respectfully, "Sir, when I was reading just now, I seem to have learned something by forgetting the characters. I wonder if this method can still be used?" The female professor looked at him quietly. After a long time she smiled and said, "According to the rules of the academy, even magic skills students can only read the books on this floor with their own power of understanding before they enter the second floor. However, you don't have the potential to cultivate, but you manage to understand some principles with your perseverance. Even though those principles aren't necessarily correct, it's still impressive. The rules of the academy cannot be broken. Then I have to give you a word." Ninkei bowed deeply and said respectfully, "Thank you for your guidance." The female professor looked at the hairpin-style small regular script on the desk in front of her and said calmly, "Reading characters, forgetting the shape, understanding the meaning, reading with intention and without intention." Ninkei knew that he had not achieved the state of forgetting the shape and meaning of the words. He had used the method of disassembling the shape, which was still far from the state of forgetting the shape. As for the word meaning, he did not know how to explain it. He could not help but shake his head and murmured the word. One can read it intentionally or unintentionally, as he walked down the stairs. It was already late at night. Usually there would not be many people under the old library at this time, but today it was very lively. Situ Ilan stood at the front, holding Jin Wutsai's hand. Chu Yuxian stood at the side of the stairs. Xie Chongyun and Zhong Dajuan could be faintly seen in the depths of the bookshelves. It seemed like they were welcoming him downstairs. Ning Ke looked at his classmates at the bottom of the stairs and was slightly stunned. He looked at Chu Yuxian and asked in a low voice, "What happened? You actually walked down by yourself?" Situ Ilan looked at him in surprise and said. Ning Ke spread out his hands and said helplessly, "I think I also walked down last time, right?" Situ Ilan smiled and said, "Let's get down to business. According to the rules of the academy over the years, the freshmen will have a gathering after entering the academy. There are always some classmates from other counties or even foreign countries who have never been to Chang, and the so-called gathering is to show everyone around, drink some wine and gossip. Our classroom 3 will also have a gathering. Wutsai and I, who have lived in Chang'an for a long time, are naturally duty-bound, so we will take the lead. It should have been held a few days ago, but because you are on sick leave it was postponed to today. We don't want to disturb you reading upstairs, so we are waiting here." Ning Ke looked at the girl in front of him and found that she had already taken off her student robe and changed into a lavender skirt. She did not look as sharp and tough as she usually did when she wore her archery uniform, but unexpectedly showed a bit of the gentleness of a noble family. Although he was eager to return to Lin 47th Street to tell Sang Sang about today's amazing encounter, he also knew that there was no way to avoid the gathering of the academy's classmates. Moreover, Classroom 3 had postponed the gathering to today in order to wait for him to recover. No matter what, he had to attend. There were all young people around him, so he said straightforwardly, "No problem." Situ Ilan laughed heartily and said, "Your straightforward character is not bad. Unlike Chan Zixian and the others who ran away with the excuse of family matters. Who doesn't know which gambling house they are in now?" Hearing the 3 words Chan Zixian, Ning Ke was slightly startled. He immediately understood that she was talking about Chan Zixian, the son of a rich businessman from Classroom 3, and not the old man who fell beside the pile of firewood and could not close his eyes. Situ Ilan looked back at the students around her and laughed heartily. "Is there any place that you want to visit, or Chang and food that you want to eat? If you don't have any ideas, then I'm the one." The students from other places all laughed and said that they had no objections. She rolled her eyes and suddenly said to Ning Ke, "How about we go for a drink? I still don't have any objections." Ning Ke said. Situ Ilan looked at his face and teased, "Last time Chu Yuxian said that you don't need to pay to drink at the House of Red Sleeves. Why don't we go there? I believe that you don't have any objections either." Ning Ke was startled. When he was about to say that he had a strong objection, he saw that she had already turned around to announce the news to the crowd. It was said that today's gathering would be held at the House of Red Sleeves. Hearing this decision, the crowd inside and outside of the old library suddenly became angry. A student from Gushan Commandery shook his head and praised, "To be able to see the real face of the world's #1 singing and dancing troupe, this trip to Chang, and is really worthwhile." A student from the capital of Great River Kingdom solemnly said, "Yes, this time we must see the Tang Emperor's favorite dance." A former captain of the Tang Empire's border army from the remote Hangu Valley said seriously, "That's right. Tonight, all of you must write some good poems to record our grand occasion." All the students shook their heads and praised. All of them seemed to be full of literary aura. But everyone knew that what these young students really wanted to see was not singing and dancing, but the famous prostitutes who were rumored to be the top of the world's brothels. What they really wanted to do was not poetry, but to make love in the brothel. Although Situ Ilan and several other ladies from official families could not really be unrestrained, it was also an excellent thing to be close to those soul-stirring beauties. Ning Ke grabbed Chu Yuxian beside him and asked in surprise, "Women can also enter the brothel? There is no place in Chang, and that these women dare not go. Moreover, the House of Red Sleeves is a singing and dancing troupe promoted by the palace. If they say they want to see the song and dance, no one can say anything." Chu Yuxian helplessly said. At this moment, a hand stretched out from the depths of the bookshelf, and a skinny student slowly moved out. It was Lin Chuan Wangying, who was known as a genius. He looked at the crowd and said timidly, "Can I go with you?" All the students looked at this 14-year-old lad and looked at each other. Situ Ilan gently bit her lips, rolled her eyes and said with a sullen face, Wang Ying, you can't go. You have to know that you are Ding Shi's. The atmosphere of the Tang Empire had always been swaying between simplicity and toughness and open-mindedness. To be more precise, it should be stepping on both sides happily and swaying back and forth. Especially for the people living in Chang'an, they were naturally simple and tough when talking about national affairs and morale, and they were naturally open-mindedness when talking about literature and romance. They never felt that there was any conflict between the two styles. The serious and upright civil officials in the imperial court would go to the tavern next to the mansion to play a song for the blind girl after leaving the court. The women in the brothel would also go to the brothel to donate when talking about the frontier fortress war. Therefore, the brothel in Chang'an was different from the brothel in other places. It was not just a place with red lanterns hanging high and full of lustful fragrance. There were also times when there were vigorous dances and clangs. Except for those censors who lived by criticizing others, no matter if it was officials or rich businessmen, they would not feel that there was anything wrong with appearing in such a place. Speaking of brothels, the first name to be mentioned was naturally the House of Red Sleeves. For many years, there had never been a signboard outside the musical bamboo courtyard, but everyone knew that it was the first signboard of the brothel industry in Chang'an and even in the Tang Empire. It was favored by the former emperor and his majesty, and had a glorious past. Even though it was far away in a quiet neighborhood, its reputation spread far and wide. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves was as bright as usual. Tonight, the spring wind was romantic. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves sang and danced to celebrate peace. Tonight, no one slept in the House of Red Sleeves. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves became a little chaotic. When more than 20 young men and women of the academy barged into the building with their heads lowered shyly or proudly, the rich businessmen and officials who were drinking and enjoying the singing and dancing in the hall suddenly froze. After recognizing the identities of several female students dressed as men, they sighed and quickly dispersed in all directions. Chang'an was indeed open. It was not uncommon for women to dress up as men to visit brothels. It was not rare for a father and a son to go to a girl one after another. However, it was still a little embarrassing for two generations to appear in the same brothel at the same time. What was strange was that in such an embarrassing situation, it was always the elders who gave way to the younger generation, such as now. Situ Ilan asked her classmates to sit down. Looking at the back of the person who slipped out of the side door of the brothel, who looked like her fourth uncle, she held back her laughter and waved her sleeves to sit down. She called the steward and asked, I know there is no rule in the brothel to reserve the whole place, but there are many of us. Is it okay to fill up the front hall and watch the singing and dancing? The steward had already recognized the identity of this famous noble lady in Chang'an, and he did not dare to neglect her and said with a bitter face, Miss Situ, or should I still call you young master today? Whatever you say, of course. You know what's good for you. Situ Ilan rolled her black eyes and threw a golden leaf to the steward. She said, bring the wine, fruits, and food quickly. Today there is a rich man paying the bill. Also, I want Lu Shui to accompany me. Last year when I came to your brothel, you said she went to the palace. It can't be so coincidental today, right? The steward revealed an awkward expression and smiled apologetically. It's true that she didn't enter the palace, but you know that His Majesty is holding a banquet for the princess's return. The girls of the song and dance troupe have been practicing hard. Miss Lu Shui is the lead dancer, so everyone specially gave her a month off. Now whether she wants to come out or not is really up to her. Speaking of the top girls in the House of Red Sleeves, Dewdrop was naturally one of them, but Lu Shui's status was a little different. She was the lead dancer in the song and dance troupe and was once praised by the Empress. If she was not willing to come out and drink with the guests, no one could force her. After all, Situ Ilan was just a young girl. She was always curious when she went to the brothel to drink and play. She was not willing to find girls who did not mind having regular guests. But Lu Shui was very different. So when she heard that Lu Shui was on vacation, she could not help but feel a little annoyed. Ning Ke lowered his head and followed his classmates into the House of Red Sleeves. He dragged Chu Yuxian to the most remote seat and quietly listened to the conversation between Situ Ilan and the steward. At the same time, he was thinking about the important problem of who would pay the bill tonight. After a while, he looked at Chu Yuxian and said with sympathy, "She said there is a rich man paying the bill today. I think it will be you who will lose money again. After all, you are a landlord and a rich man in Chang'an City." Chu Yuxian opened his folding fan and said sarcastically, "Obviously, the rich man tonight is surnamed Ning." After saying this, he stood up and scolded the steward with a smile. "Hua Xiao, are you blind? Look who's sitting beside me. Hurry up and call Lu Shui and Dewdrop out." Oh. Chapter 98. The steward called Hua Xiao thought of a lad who often appeared in court at the House of Red Sleeves in the 13th year of the Tianqi era. His heart tightened and he looked toward the source of the voice. He saw clearly the face of the person beside the first young master Chu, and found that it was the wicked guy who called girls without paying. His body suddenly became stiff and his expression became extremely ugly. He thought bitterly in his heart, "Since we haven't seen each other for a long time, why should we meet again today?" For people in the service industry, their thoughts and behaviors could never be synchronized. Steward Hua kept cursing Ning Kei's parents and ancestors in his heart, but the ugly expression on his face quickly turned into a few bright flowers. He did not dare to hesitate and bowed to that person across several tables. Then he turned around and put his right hand to his lips, shouting cheerfully toward the quiet and sparsely lit upstairs, "Ladies upstairs and downstairs. Young Master Ning Kei is here." No one knew how many people in the building were shocked by this shout. The students who were pretending to be shy and calm or pretending to be proud of themselves all looked at Ning Kei's table in surprise. Situ Ilan held the teacup and opened her mouth in surprise. Jean Wucai could no longer maintain her gentle expression and thought to herself, "What kind of reception is this? Why does it seem that everyone in the House of Red Sleeves knows Ning Kei?" The students were surprised and expectant. They looked up to the upstairs with curiosity and disbelief. They wanted to see how many girls would poke their heads out to see Steward Hua after his shout. The music on the balcony had stopped and it was quiet in the building. There were no beauties who could not wait to look at Ning Kei, no girls who smiled and waved to him, and even no maidservants who came to check on the situation for their mistress appeared. Just when the expectant students were a little disappointed, some felt a little balanced, and Situ Ilan felt a little bored. Suddenly there was a dense sound of footsteps in and behind the building. Just like big and small pearls falling on a jade plate, or like heavy rain and light rain playing in the spring breeze pavilion, in the sound of footsteps, beads swaying, and orioles singing and swallows talking, 6 or 7 girls from the backyard of the building came out in a line with their personal maidservants. They gathered in the hall like flowing water, and then came to Ning Kei's side. Some of them blamed him for not coming for a few days, some of them gently cared why he did not come these days, and some of them frowned and wondered if something had happened to him. In short, it was very lively. While they were busy, a little girl with a cute pair of hair poked out from the top floor. She was Mistress Jian's personal maidservant, Xiao Chao. Her dark eyes rolled around, but she didn't see the person she wanted to see. She shouted unhappily, "Ning Kei, why isn't Sang Sang here? You shut her up in the shop again." That night, the bored girls in the House of Red Sleeves who were preparing to go to the palace to practice singing and dancing. They ridiculed and hurt the fragile and sensitive heart of a young man, and pushed Ning Kei into the building. After that night, things began to change subtly. Whether it was Dewdrop or Lu Shui, or those ordinary girls, they all treated Ning Kei very warmly and cordially. There were only 3 reasons. First, Ning Kei had a clean and pleasant face, and was a rare young man in the brothel. He spoke well, behaved in a cute manner, and respected the girls. Moreover, they didn't have that kind of relationship, so they got along with each other easily and became very familiar with each other. Second, Dewdrop doted on this guy because of some purely personal reasons, so the girls of the Zhu family naturally gave him more face. The most important reason was naturally that Mistress Jian had once expressed a certain degree of concern for this lad. This concern was not obvious, but it was too rare for Mistress Jian, who had always been indifferent to men and even hated them. Dewdrop and Lu Shui did not care about it, but for the other girls, if they could please Mistress Jian, not to mention being more intimate with Ning Ke, even if they had to sacrifice their bodies for a few nights, it would not be a big deal. However, the academy's classmates didn't know these reasons, nor did they know how many times Ning Ke went in and out of the House of Red Sleeves in this spring. They were already dumbfounded as they looked at the girls around the table and listened to their sweet voices. Situilan finally put down the teacup slowly and closed her mouth. But when she saw Lu Shui, whom she had failed to invite twice, sitting beside Ning Ke and chatting with him while eating melon seeds, she couldn't help but look at Jin Wucai, who was dressed as a man, and said with a shocked expression, Chu Yuxian didn't lie. Ning Ke really can go anywhere in the House of Red Sleeves. This guy is much more respected than my arrogant cousins. While they were talking, Ning Ke and the girls had finished their greetings and bid farewell to each other warmly. Then he raised his right hand slightly to hold Lu Shui's hand and walked to Situ Ilan's table. He said with a smile, Miss Situ, I've brought Lu Shui here for you. You have to pity her for her hard practice recently, and let her go back to rest early. Situ Ilan stood up and pretended to be angry but was actually happy. She said, we girls are talking, it's none of your business. After saying this, she turned around and bowed to Lu Shui. She said very seriously, Sister Lu Shui, I've always wanted to see you and ask you about the middle 3 kicks of the Huxian dance. It's a pleasure to meet you today. I hope you can teach me. Lu Shui slightly frowned. She was indeed a little tired, but she knew it was not a good choice to act like a famous prostitute in front of these noble ladies of Chang, and Jin Wucai also stood up and gently tapped the thumb and forefinger of her left hand with the folding fan in her right hand. She said with a smile, Miss Lu Shui, my sister Situ wants to learn the middle 3 kicks of the Huxian dance because it's the 60th birthday of Yunhui General at the end of this year. She wants to present this dance as a gift. It's not necessary for her to learn it today. I just hope you can spare some time for her. I see. Lu Shui smiled faintly and said, then I will dance a little tonight. In the future, if Miss Situ wants to invite me, you only need to inform me of the time in advance. It will be very convenient whether you come or I go to your residence. The Hu dance had nothing to do with the grassland barbarians, but came from the Yueluan kingdom. It was said that its origin was the sacrificial dance of a rainforest tribe in the extreme west of the Yueluan kingdom. It was famous for its lively rhythm, especially when the upper part of the dancer's body was still like a fairy scattering flowers, while the lower part was shaking rapidly. The waist, abdomen, and thighs were dancing with the song, which would form a very sharp contrast of beauty. This kind of dance was extremely difficult. The lower 3 kicks were relatively easy to achieve, but it was extremely difficult to complete the middle 3 kicks or even the upper 3 kicks while keeping the upper part of the upper body modestly still. The best Hu dance girl in the world was in Chang, and of the Tang Empire, in the House of Red Sleeves. She was Lu Shui. In the sound of the pipa there was a faint flute fluttering. The lights in the quiet building dimmed slightly. When the curtain was lifted, Lu Shui, who was wearing a gauze dance gown that exposed her abdomen and wrapped around her buttocks, walked in. Her eyes were gentle and her hands were clasped in front of her white breasts. Neither her fingertips nor her eyelashes trembled. However, her bare snow-like feet were slowly dancing to the music. Especially as the pipa became more and more urgent, the frequency of her feet stepping on the stage became faster and faster. Her thighs and buttocks tightly wrapped by the gauze dance gown kept shaking like lightning, and her exposed abdomen swayed with fine lines. After the dance, countless cheers rang out, and then the building returned to a warm and lively atmosphere. Situ Ilan seriously toasted Lu Shui, and everyone casually said a few words. Lu Shui, who looked tired, gently apologized and went back to her own yard to rest. Huxian was the best accompaniment to wine. Tonight, there were more than 20 young students in the House of Red Sleeves, who were in the middle of their youth. Immediately the wine went down quickly. The elegant sound of Mengshu's drinking was mixed with the sound of chips being tossed. The hall was lively and cheerful. Tonight, Ning Ke had been pushed into the limelight by Chu Yuxian, and the manager of the brothel. Naturally, he became the center of the drinking scene. Regardless of whether they were familiar with each other or not, the students all went up to him and tried to persuade him for various reasons. In the beginning, they would still play drinking games, But when they realized that Ninkei was really a genius at playing drinking games, and after he won more than 10 rounds the drinking games became drinking games. Ninkei liked to drink and he liked the taste of wine even more. These years, he had been drinking with Sang Sang. But it was a pity or sad that after drinking for so many years, his capacity for liquor did not increase at all. Basically, he was still in the state of looking at the wine and drinking games, but because he was too drunk, he basically had no chance to do so. After being urged by his classmates to drink 5 or 6 glasses of wine, he became anxious. His drunkenness, which was only 7%, suddenly jumped to 12%. He forced his eyes open, trying to pretend that he was still sober to scare off his enemies. However, his already inarticulate speech revealed his weak confidence. So he wanted to hug the full moon to pretend to be lonely and hide from drinking, but found that there was still no moon in the night sky. He wanted to lean against the railing and pour wine into the lake to get drunk and recite poems to pretend to be desperate, but found that he could not walk to the railing and could not remember any poems, no matter in the previous life or this life. He did not know when the table he was sitting at was moved to the railing at the back of the building, just close to the small pond of wet bamboo, but he was already paralyzed on the edge of the table, and had long forgotten what he had planned to do. The environment by the railing was much quieter than in the hall. Situilan sat beside him with her right foot on the railing, squinting at the stars in the sky. Her right hand was holding a small pot of clear jade house snow, gently shaking it outside the railing. Obviously, this noblewoman's capacity for liquor was much better than Ninkei's. The luster in her eyes was very bright. She suddenly asked, "Ninkei, how did you and Sister Princess meet?" Ninkei raised his head and rubbed between his eyebrows. Then he raised his chopsticks and kept looking for the cabbage head in vinegar. He casually answered, "I met her on the road." "How did you meet her on the road?" Situilan turned her head and stared at him with interest. Ninkei inserted his chopsticks into the small pastry, covered his forehead and said angrily, "I picked her up on the road, so we met." Situilan said helplessly, "I think you probably remembered something wrong. Her Highness couldn't have been picked up by you on the road." Ninkei smiled with drunkenness. "Indeed, I remembered wrong. All the things I picked up on the road are treasures. I can't be an idiot. Where did I meet the princess? Oh yes, you know I'm a soldier of the city of Wei." Oh. Chapter 99. Is the city of Wei very far? Very close to Kaiping. Where is Kaiping? Very close to the city of Wei. Well, I know it's in the frontier fortress. But before that, where were you, Ninkei? In the mountain. Which mountain? Min Mountain. Is Min Mountain very big? Of course. What about before Min Mountain? What about before? Oh well, I was young then, so I don't remember much. I only know that I was an orphan. The drunken conversation by the side of the bar could not continue because of Ninkei's slurred speech and his stubborn mind. Situilan picked up a wet towel and wiped her forehead. She glared at the drunk lad on the table and thought to herself, "What the hell is going on?" Just at this moment, Dewdrop, who had to leave midway, came and diluted the awkwardness. She frowned at the back of Ninkei's head and could not help but shake her head. She helped him up and put a wet towel on his forehead. Then she smiled at Situilan and said in a hoarse voice, "Miss Situ, he can't hold his liquor well." Before Situilan could open her mouth to ridicule him, Ninkei, who was lying in Dewdrop's arms, woke up. His mind was in a blur, and he vaguely felt that his face was pressed against a slightly cool, moist, and plump place. Subconsciously or instinctively, he held her waist tightly with both hands and pressed his face closer to her, even rubbing against it. Dewdrop's plump bosom was squeezed out of shape by the young man's bad taste. Her delicate and pretty little face showed a rare hint of charming shyness, and there were a few blushes on it. Situilan looked at Ninkei squinting in Dewdrop's arms. She watched him put his hands into the girl's sleeves and then move to somewhere. She could not help but raise her head and cover her forehead in annoyance. She also covered her eyes. After all, she was a noble lady of the Yunhui general's mansion in Chang'an. Seeking pleasure in the brothel was just a matter of elegance. When had she ever seen someone actually dared to do indecent things in front of her? Of course, she knew that Ning-Kei had drunk too much at this time. He was so drunk that he might not even be able to tell whether he was hugging a waist or a willow, rubbing a chest or a big steamed bun. But for an unmarried girl, even one who was famous for being bold and unrestrained in Chang'an City, this scene was really unbearable. She stood up in embarrassment and anger, pulled Ning-Kei up, and continued to pour wine into his mouth. Ning-Kei vaguely felt that someone was trying to force him to drink more wine. How could he allow that to happen? He hugged Dewdrop's waist tightly and refused to let go. His palm slid down her lapel and kept rubbing the girl's soft and plump abdomen. He kept muttering nonsense like, "This is better than drinking wine, and I won't drink anymore." Dewdrop giggled as he touched her. She hurriedly lifted her sleeve to cover her lips and said with an annoyed smile, "You'll have to pay if you touch me again." Ning-Kei lowered himself in her arms and answered in a daze, "Your brother is now a man with a net worth of 2,000 taels of silver. Do I still need this little bit of silver? If a monk can touch you, why can't I touch you? So what if we spend a spring together?" Dewdrop was a little annoyed when she heard this, but she was confused when she heard the word monk. She raised her head and looked at Situilan for help. Situilan spread out her hands and said angrily, "How would I know what nonsense you are talking about?" Then she used a little strength to grab the front of Ning-Kei's lapel and forcibly lifted him up. She got close to his face and said loudly, "You've drunk too much. Go back quickly. Don't tell me there's no one waiting for you at home?" No one knew whether it was because he had been blown by the night wind for a long time, or because Situilan shook him hard, or some key words in this sentence that touched the sensitive soul in Ning-Kei's mind. He suddenly stiffened and slowly woke up. He opened his dull eyes and looked at the night view outside the fence and murmured, "Yes, there's someone waiting for me at home." Situilan and Dewdrop looked at each other and heaved a sigh of relief at the same time. They were not concerned about where Ning-Kei got the 2,000 taels of silver from. What they were happy about was that the two of them finally did not have to accompany this young master, who suddenly became rich from the poor, to go crazy. However, to their surprise, Ning-Kei stood up shakily, broke away from Situilan's hand and gently avoided her. Dewdrop, who wanted to help him, staggered into the building. She grabbed a writing brush from the accountant's office and tore a page of the account book. Yushan leaned against the table and wrote some numbers in cursive with drunken eyes. Then he said, "Send it back to Lin 47th Street for me." Dewdrop moved closer to take a look and saw a few words scribbled on the account book. The frame of the words was crooked and scattered, and the white strands were unclear. If one did not look carefully, they would not be able to tell what was written. "Young Master Sang, I'm drunk today, so I won't come back to sleep. Remember to drink the chicken soup left in the pot." Ning-Kei was a man who looked gentle on the outside but was extremely calm and self-controlled in his bones. He knew very well that he could not hold his liquor, so he rarely lost control of himself after drinking too much, except when he was drinking with Sang. However, the situation was a little different this time. He was so happy today that he felt depressed without any alcohol to liven things up. This joy that came from the bottom of his heart had nothing to do with the endless nights in the brothel, nor did it have anything to do with his classmates from the academy taking advantage of their youth. It was purely because he saw the message on the thin piece of paper in the old library. In the warm afternoon sunshine, he vaguely saw the direction of the door to the wonderful world. After more than 10 years of desperate searching, he finally saw a glimmer of hope. What else in the world could be more suitable than this, and what else could be more suitable than this? What else could be more suitable than this? What else could be more suitable than this? Dewdrop saw his cute drunken look and could not help laughing. She held his left arm and shook her head, saying, "Don't drink anymore. I'll ask the carriage company to send you home later." Ning-Kei gently held her hand. His palm was slightly wet with sweat. Only then did he realize that the saying of being drunk made sense. He slightly narrowed his eyes to hide his nervousness and pretended to be calm, saying, "I won't go back tonight. It's not good for you to drink and have fun with your classmates." Dewdrop smiled and teased, "Where's the elegance?" Ning-Kei said under the influence of the liquor, "I'm just a little soldier who was sent here. How would I know what elegance is? My good sister, how about letting me be vulgar tonight? Don't pretend to be crazy when you're drunk. You'll regret it when you wake up. Dewdrop laughed and said, if you're sober on normal days, let alone once, I can even let you be vulgar 3 times. So what? Ninkei squinted his drunk eyes and waved his hand repeatedly. He said with a silly smile, that won't do. That would be the 3 vulgarities. I can't listen to this nonsense anymore. Situ Ilan frowned and covered her forehead to suppress the rolling drunkenness in her stomach. She said, Ninkei, if you want to fool around, can't you pick another day? Ninkei reluctantly stood up and bowed deeply. He said, Miss Situ, this is the place you picked. If it were another day, I really wouldn't have the guts to accompany a girl to a brothel. Situ Ilan was speechless for a moment. She glared at him and thought, you still know that you're accompanying a girl to a brothel? Then why don't we just listen to some songs, watch some dance and talk about art and life? Why do we have to do this? Fortunately, she did not say this out loud. Otherwise, Ninkei would have ridiculed her for a long time about the difference between artistic young girls and normal young girls. Dewdrop smiled and looked at Ning Quebec. She said sympathetically, Ninkei, you seem to have forgotten one thing. Mistress Jian has said that no one is allowed to entertain you. Where can you go? As soon as Dewdrop finished her words, an arrogant and indifferent little maidservant appeared in front of everyone with a bowl of fishtail soup. She was Mistress Jian's personal maidservant, Xiao Chao. She stared at Ninkei's eyes coldly and said, Mistress Jian has said that no one is allowed to let him drink it. Ninkei, you drink this bowl of soup and immediately take a bath to get rid of the stench on you. Then follow me upstairs. Mistress Jian has something to ask you. In novels, there was a common sentence to describe the behavior of a master, and that was, it takes a long time to say it, but it happens in the blink of an eye. The maidservant Xiao Chao appeared just like this, and her words were also very effective. As soon as she said this, those eager academy students were stopped by the girls around them. Ninkei even let go of the flagon dejectedly. The whole hall was silent. When Ninkei went to wash up, the academy students in the building inevitably talked about what had happened earlier. Especially those Chong, and students who knew Mistress Jian's identity. They could not help but talk about some secrets in the palace and a certain legend of the Tang Empire. Therefore, everyone was more curious about what had happened earlier. It was still quiet beside the railing. Situ Ilan and Jean Wucai whispered a few words to each other before walking over again. She stood not far from Dewdrop and looked curiously at this outstanding figure in the brothel in the capital city. She asked softly, even if Ninkei was lucky enough to catch Mistress Jian's attention, no matter you or Lu Shui with your current status, you don't need to deliberately curry favor with him. Therefore, I'm very curious about why. It's interesting that Ninkei was tricked into this brothel. That night, Mistress Jian made it clear that the girls in this brothel are not allowed to serve him. It's okay for other brothels in Chong, but none of the girls in this brothel dare to disobey Mistress Jian's order. However, he still comes here often. What does this mean? Dewdrop's eyes moved and she replied softly with a smile. This means that the young man comes here to chat with us girls, and we, in fact, really want to chat with him. Situ Ilan supported her chin with her hand and leaned against the railing thoughtfully. Dewdrop smiled and continued, we like to chat with him because we can't just chat with him in our daily chats. We always have to think about how to make those censors happy and vice ministers happy. And Ninkei likes to chat with us because he has pressure in his bones and needs to chat to relax. Now it seems that he can only really relax by chatting with girls like us in a place like this. Situ Ilan frowned and her eyes were filled with the curiosity of a young girl. What pressure can he have? I don't know what's wrong with Ninkei's life, but I know there must be something wrong. Dewdrop gradually stopped smiling and said pitifully, in your eyes, Ninkei is just a calm and simple lad. Only the poor people like us who have seen countless hardships can see the pitifulness hidden in his body. Finally, this popular girl in Chong, and said softly, besides, I'm also an orphan without parents. Chapter 100. Ninkei pushed open the red door, lifted the bead curtain, and walked into the dimly lit quiet room. He drank 2 big bowls of fishtail soup to sober him up, took a hot bath, and was heavily ravaged by the master chef on the bamboo bed where someone had died. The previous drunkenness had already faded by half, and he had become much more sober. Looking at the woman with a perfect figure hidden in cloth clothes, her broad and smooth forehead, and the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes, Ning Kei felt that it would be better if he were more drunk at this moment. He had vaguely guessed what he would face next. Although he always thought that the woman's strictness towards him was unreasonable, he had to admit that there was some care in her strictness. Therefore, he could not refuse and could only bear it with tears. I haven't seen you for a while. I thought you had started to cultivate yourself after entering the academy, and understood the importance of wanting to know and seeking knowledge. I didn't expect that you didn't learn much, but your courage to drink has increased a lot. Mistress Jian looked at him calmly. There was no pain in her simple and kind eyes. She just spoke calmly and straightforwardly, but it was this kind of normal conversation that brought great pressure to Ning Quebec. He did not know what to say, so he forced himself to calm down and tried to smile to relieve the awkwardness. But unexpectedly he burped, and the smell was very unpleasant. Smelling the sour smell of alcohol in the room, Mistress Jian slightly frowned and glared at him unhappily. Then she smiled faintly and thought that her anger was unreasonable. She could not let the lad in front of her take the blame for that guy, could she? She looked at Ning Kei and asked as calmly as possible, "Tell me what you have learned in the academy these days." Ning Kei took the strong tea that Xiao Chao handed over and hurriedly drank 2 mouthfuls to calm his mind. After sincerely thanking her, he cleared his throat unhurriedly and earnestly told Mistress Jian about his life in the academy. "You're quite diligent, but since you have no foundation in calligraphy and rites, you should spend more effort on these 2 subjects, and not just ignore them like a broken jar. You should know that after you leave the academy in the future, whether you become an official in the imperial court or a herdsman, you will always need these skills." Hearing that Ning Kei went to the old library every day, Mistress Jian smiled, and the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes deepened. She continued to ask, "Since you go to the old library every day, you must know about the 2nd floor?" "Yes," Ning Kei replied politely. Mistress Jian thought for a while and then said seriously, "When do you think you can enter the 2nd floor?" Ning Kei raised his sleeve to cover his mouth, forcibly suppressing the desire to burp or even vomit. He shook his head and replied, "Anyone who can enter that place is a cultivation genius. But my body can't carry out cultivation at all, so I dare not have any thoughts of entering the 2nd floor." "Can't you grow up a little? It's rare for you to enter such a good place like the academy, so you should cherish the opportunity to learn. Don't talk nonsense about being infatuated." Mistress Jian looked at him, frowning and shaking her head. She sighed at his lack of ambition. Years ago she saw that guy riding a donkey and riding it all the way to the 2nd floor. Now she vaguely associated Ning Kei with that guy in her heart, and inevitably had some thoughts of making up for the regret. She could not help but continue to persuade him. The academy itself is a place to create miracles. But if you don't think miracles can happen, then no one can help you. Ning Kei did not know that senior who rode a little black donkey straight into Chang, and finally made a name for himself in the world, but eventually disappeared like duckweed in the wind and rain. Naturally, he did not understand why Mistress Jian paid so much attention to a poor boy like him. He knew there must be some reasons behind this attention, but he did not care what those reasons were. In the face of a kind woman's earnest teaching, he was still sincerely grateful, because he had always lacked this part of his life. In his previous life, the back seat of a bicycle might be another form of care, but he did not like it. In this life he also had it before he was 4 years old, but it was eventually swallowed by blood. Because he was sincerely grateful or even moved, Ning Kei answered Mistress Jian's questions carefully and seriously, and his speed was a little slow. But in Mistress Jian's eyes, this made her feel a little annoyed. "You and I are neither relatives nor friends. If it were not for the passion in my heart, I would not have bothered to say these words to you. So don't have any negative feelings. I am not doing you any harm by asking you to cherish the opportunity to study in the academy." Mistress Jian looked at him seriously and said, "Last time I told you that rich young masters like Chu Yuxian can play here, but a poor boy like you is not qualified to play here. Today it is even more so. Chong and noble ladies like Miss Situ and Miss Jean can play here, but you are not qualified to play here. They are close to you because they find you amusing and are temporarily curious about you. This interest is not necessarily malicious, but it is not real respect. If you want to be their real friend, then you must have some ability and bearing that is worthy of their respect. If you can enter the second floor of the academy, I believe that everyone in the world will be willing to be your friend. Mistress Jian picked up the golden orchid dew on the table and took a sip to moisten her throat. Then she looked up at him and continued calmly, in the future, you can come to the brothel to relax, but not too often. You can't drink too much. I am a nanny in the brothel, so I don't think that loitering in the brothel is a lowly behavior, but I also don't think that it is a good thing to do. 30 years ago, the great poet Mr. Chao Siuan spent the first half of his life in the brothel, but who dared to disrespect him? He even married the Prime Minister's daughter, but it was not because he had made a name for himself in the brothel, but because his poetry was unparalleled in the world and he was talented. The Tang Empire values talent. As long as you have talent and you are a talent, no matter if you are upstairs or downstairs, inside or outside the brothel, a boy from the border town or a noble in Chong, and the empire will not bury you. After the lecture, Ning Ke went downstairs with his hand on his forehead and found that the gathering in the hall had ended. After asking the steward in the building, he found out that eldest young Miss Situ was the one who finally paid for the gathering of his classmates. When he heard this news and thought about how he could maintain his 2,000 taels of silver for a while longer, he couldn't help but feel very lucky. When he was about to say goodbye to Dewdrop and the others, the maidservant Xiao Chao, who had received Mistress Jian's order, chased him to the horse carriage and ordered the coachman to send the drunken lad back to Lin 47th Street as fast as possible. Sitting in the galloping horse carriage, Ning Ke felt like dying, drunk and nauseous. But somehow, his mind was clear and he kept thinking about that serious question. I did not hesitate to destroy my body and spirit to stay in the old library to enter the second floor of the academy. It was because I like it, but also because I want to take revenge and improve my strength. Do I have to add another reason in the future, to be able to roam the brothel? When Ning Ke was lost in his thoughts on the horse carriage, another guest came to Dewdrop's courtyard. As one of the popular girls in the House of Red Sleeves, she had the right to choose and even reject guests to a certain extent, except for regular guests like the censor Zhang Yiqi. But for this guest who just entered the courtyard late at night, she just forcibly wiped away the gloomy expression on her face and forced herself to pour tea for him. Go wash your face. Pretty girl like you can't be as dirty as me. The guest who entered the courtyard late at night was a tall and thin old man wearing an extremely old Taoist robe. His robe was stained with oil stains here and there, and there seemed to be a few leftover rice grains between the lapels of the robe. It was extremely dirty. The tall and thin Taoist's face was not dirty, but there were a few sparse long beards under his chin. His inverted triangular eyes flickered, and his obscene aura was extremely dirty. Dewdrop smiled and followed the maidservant to freshen up. She only knew that this guest was important and was a distinguished guest who was personally invited by Mistress Jian, but she did not know who he was or what kind of business he did. As for external things such as appearance and clothes, they were never the focus of her or the maidservant's attention. What was important was that this Taoist had always been extremely generous. Moreover, he called himself the primordial spirit protector. He had come 2 or 3 times, but he only took action and refused to be serious. There was no reason for the girls in the brothel not to like this kind of guest. The dirty, skinny and tall Taoist poured himself a cup of wine and drank it slowly. Just as he was feeling bored, he saw a crumpled piece of paper beside the wine pot. It was the most ordinary paper for an account book. He could vaguely see the handwriting on it. Based on his habit of cultivating for decades, he instinctively picked up the crumpled paper and carefully spread it on the table. There was a line of ink written on the crumpled paper. The words were unclear, and the frame was crooked and messy, which made it unpleasant to look at. On the paper was written, "Young Master Sang Sang, I'm drunk today and won't be coming back to sleep. Remember to drink the leftover chicken soup on the pot." Looking at these words, the tall and thin Taoist's brows furrowed tightly. But what was surprising was that when he furrowed his brows, he did not show disgust but surprise and joy. The tall and thin Taoist carefully read the words that looked like a chicken's claw. His eyes finally fell on the word chicken soup at the end of the sentence. His right hand, which was as skinny as an old tree trunk, dipped into the wine cup, and then put his fingers on the table and began to copy, stroke by stroke. The wine on his fingers dragged on the mahogany table to form words, which were very similar to the word chicken soup, written by Ninkei on the paper. Vaguely, there seemed to be streams of air flowing through the tall and thin Taoist's fingers into the wine, seeping into the depths of the hard mahogany, and then instantly dispersed into countless tiny cyclones and disappeared without a trace. Dewdrop, who was dressing up outside the room, seemed to have sensed something. She looked at the reflection of the sky full of stars in the basin in front of her and was stunned. She did not know why she suddenly felt homesick. She missed the warm home that only existed in her imagination, and had never appeared in her life. She missed the taste of her mother's chicken soup that she had never tasted before. Chapter 101. The lanky Taoist dipped his finger in the wine and wrote on the mahogany table. Soon he copied the 29 characters on the account book paper. He put his finger into his dry lips and licked it. Then he put his hands behind his back, lowered his body and put his face close to the table. He carefully continued to examine the paper on the account book paper. As he read, he frowned more and more, shook his head more and more frequently, and looked more and more confused. He murmured, "What kind of writing is this? I've never seen it before. There is no fluctuation of primordial qi, but why is the meaning of the brush so abundant? It's obviously scattered to the point of a mess, but why can it make people suddenly nervous after concentrating on it?" The lanky Taoist shook his head and stood up straight. He walked half a circle in the room and then quickly walked back to the mahogany table. He lowered his head and continued to look at the handwriting on the account book paper. He still frowned and shook his head, saying repeatedly, "It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Does it make sense? It doesn't make sense." No matter how the three major cultivation sects or countries quarreled with each other, no one dared to disrespect the divine talisman master. That was because there were few cultivators in the world, and the divine talisman master was even rarer. The divine talisman master, who stood between the secular world and the secular cultivation, could create wind and rain and startle ghosts and gods when he wrote. He was too important for cultivation and war, and was an almost non-renewable resource. The Tang Empire was the most powerful country in the world. However, it never had more than 10 divine talisman masters. Most of them had already left the secular world and lived in seclusion in the academy or in the forest. They devoted their remaining life to finding the secrets between the veins of heaven and earth. There were not many divine talisman masters who were still in the world. 2 of the 4 divine talisman masters in the South School of Haotian Taoism were messengers sent to Chang, and by the West Hill Divine Palace to show their power. They did not stay in Chang and for long, so there were only 2 divine talisman masters in the South School of Haotian Taoism. The lanky priest who visited the House of Red Sleeves at night was one of the 2 divine talisman masters. His name was Yen Sei, the senior brother of Li Qingfeng, the nation master of the Tang Empire, and the High Minister of Offerings of the South School of Haotian Taoism. He was fond of strong wine, beautiful women, and wonderful books. In terms of the art of calligraphy and talisman, he was already one of the top figures in the world. That night when it was raining heavily in the spring rain, he drew a well talisman with the help of the rainwater in the alley and scared Wang Jinglu, the cultivation genius of the Tang Empire, who was known to be invincible below knowing destiny, into a crying fat boy. In addition to all kinds of magical talisman techniques, divine talisman masters were most praised for their wonderful realm and ability of painting on the desk and paper. There was a saying in the world that a great painter could not become a divine talisman master if he did not have the potential for cultivation. However, all divine talisman masters must be great calligraphers or great painters who could leave their names in history. Yen Sei was a divine talisman master who frequented brothels for pleasure. As long as he was willing, He could become a leading figure in the world of calligraphy. But such a figure was so interested in the scribbled handwriting on an account book that he could not understand it even after racking his brains. If the calligraphers of the Tang Empire or the powerhouses in the cultivation world saw this scene, they would definitely be shocked speechless. And they would definitely be very curious about who on earth was this person who could write these words that could make a divine talisman master feel distressed. It was not because Ning Ke had great ability that the dignified divine talisman master Yen Sei racking his brains could not understand a piece of cursive handwriting. It was because of various reasons that he happened to be in a certain state of mind when he wrote this note tonight. Today, he was enlightened when he read the books in the old building. He forgot the meaning of the words but remembered their shapes. Feeling happy and enlightened, he went to the brothel with his classmates to drink. In a daze, he randomly picked up the brush pen to write cursive handwriting. Then, he naturally followed the principles that he understood when he read the books in the brothel in the daytime and forgot all the strict rules of writing. Even when he was drunk, he subconsciously scattered all the rules of writing. He twisted the plum blossoms and overturned the grape trellis. But this writing method was different. It wedged the hidden interest of the cultivation method from another stiff and clumsy way. If it was another great calligrapher in Chang and city who read this cursive handwriting, he would not feel much. But in the eyes of a divine talisman master, he always felt that he had scratched his own itch. It was a secret place on his back that he had not scratched for 60 years. It was a place that he had not scratched in the past 60 years. But once he knew it, it itched to the bone. As for the divine talisman master Yen Sei saying that Ning Ke's cursive handwriting could not be understood, it was not wrong at all. Because Ning Ke did not understand the principles of cultivation, and the snow mountain and ocean of qi acupoints in his body were still blocked. Now he just wanted to find a winding and long path to go up the mountain, but there was still a huge rock at the end of the path. How could he get through? The meaning of the words meant that every stroke in the middle, and the following strokes contained the intention and thought of the calligrapher at that time. Ning Ke's cursive handwriting of 29 words could be said to be incomprehensible. That was because he could not understand it, so the meaning was trapped in the ink and could not be penetrated. But now that the dignified divine talisman master Yen Sei had copied it, no matter how powerful Tao Qi was, he could no longer imprison the intention in the strokes and words. The wine seeped into the hard mahogany table, and the wine spread to the air and then spread to the whole house of red sleeves. At that time, Ning Ke was drunk when he wrote this to Sang Sang. It seemed that he wanted to express his intention to stay in the house of red sleeves for the night. But when the true meaning hidden in the ink was fully released, it revealed his true intention. He did not think that was his intention, or he was not willing to admit it. In the courtyard of a few plum trees in the west, Lu Shui was silent with a long flute in her arms. Her beautiful and haggard face was full of sorrow. Looking at the old plum trees in the corner of the courtyard, she missed the spring in her hometown in the south. In the courtyard of a few bamboo trees in the east, Dewdrop stared blankly at the basin full of stars. Bright tears rolled down her smooth cheeks like pearls and fell into the basin, making a soft sound. In the quiet room on the top floor behind the bead curtain, Mistress Jian looked at the portrait beside the bed. Her broad forehead wrinkled into a deep frown. She looked at the young scholar riding a black donkey in the portrait. She looked at his familiar raised eyebrows and looked at his spirited and even arrogant laughter. Tears slowly flowed down her face. She murmured in a low voice, "Kahoran, you bastard. I made chicken soup for you every day when you came back, but you didn't come. Now, even if you wanted to drink it, you can't. I don't know. How are you living in the underground?" Suddenly, she raised her eyebrows and woke up with a tight grip on the silk handkerchief in her hand. She hurried to the railing and looked at the courtyard downstairs. She knew the identity of the thin and tall Taoist in Dewdrop's courtyard, but she was not afraid at all. She scolded softly with an angry face, "You old man, you are so unreasonable. Why did you come to my house to provoke me? Why did you think of that bastard?" In the courtyard, Dewdrop, who had washed her face and put on some light makeup, walked back to the room leisurely. When she saw the tall and thin Taoist shaking his head by the table, she couldn't help but be slightly startled. She walked up to him and took a look. She frowned and asked doubtfully, "Sir, why did I smell chicken soup earlier?" "It's not the smell of chicken soup. It's the smell of going home." The divine talisman master Yensei shook his head and pointed at the 29 characters scribbled in ink on the account book. He said, when this man wrote this note, he was very anxious to go home and drink the leftover chicken soup. The chicken soup may not be delicious. I'm just curious about Sang Sang, who should be a woman. I don't know whether she is his fierce wife or strict mother. How could she force him to be like this? Isn't this note written by Ninkei? Dewdrop's delicate face was full of confusion. He didn't look like he wanted to go home at that time. Sang Sang is not his wife, but his little handmaiden. Little handmaiden? That's even more unreasonable. The divine talisman master Yensei shook his head and no longer cared about this matter. He had never married in his life because he had seen too many fierce wives like tigers in the Tang Empire, especially in Chang'an. He only wanted to linger in the bushes of flowers and taste fresh food all day long. Therefore, he could not understand why a little handmaiden and a bowl of leftover chicken soup were worth so much of his attention. The next morning, the thin and tall Taoist left in a carriage without asking who the person who wrote the 29 characters was. After a while, Dewdrop walked over while yawning and rubbing her sleepy eyes. She had long forgotten all the emotions from last night. She took a sip of the hot tea served by the maidservant and subconsciously glanced at the table. She found that the tattered account book and notepad had disappeared, and the 29 cursive characters that the lanky Taoist had copied on the mahogany table with his finger had long dried up and disappeared. She shook her head with a smile and put down the teacup in her hand. The emerald bracelet on her wrist gently knocked on the mahogany table. A very light sound was heard, and a very fine red paint powder was shaken off the table. Dewdrop was slightly shocked and opened her eyes to look at it curiously. After a moment of hesitation, she gently wiped it with the silk handkerchief in her sleeve. Under the red paint powder was a row of extremely sloppy handwriting. These handwriting did not seem to be deep, but the traces were so deep in the wood that it could not be erased. It could be said that the handwriting had penetrated deep into the wood. "Young Master Sang Sang, I'm drunk today, so I won't come back to sleep. Remember to drink the remaining chicken soup in the pot." Dewdrop opened her eyes and stared at the scribbled handwriting on the mahogany table. She vaguely understood something. She did not know that the skinny and tall Taoist was the legendary divine talisman master, nor could she see how great karma Ninkei would have in the future. However, she knew that the skinny and tall Taoist must have an extraordinary background. She sincerely hoped that Ninkei would have a great karma Ninkei would have in the future. More importantly, she had a natural sensitivity to opportunities after having seen countless people. Thus, she immediately ordered the maidservant to carefully put away the table and keep it safe for the future. On the other side, the divine talisman master Yensei went out of the brothel and boarded a shabby carriage. After a short journey in Chang'an City, he met a young Taoist with a yellow paper umbrella under his armpit. The young Taoist respectfully replied, "Uncle, I've found out what you asked me to do. That person is called Ninkei, and he escorted the princess. Liu Qingchen has seen him and confirmed that he has no potential. I've also seen him in the academy a few days ago, but he did not even enter the course of magic skills." The divine talisman master sighed with pity. Not to mention the relationship between the lad and her highness, it was already a hopeless situation that he could not open all his acupoints. Did he have to ask the West Hill Divine Palace to gather the power of several great divine priests to help this lad open his acupoints by force? It was hard to find a successor for the wonderful talisman technique. Last night he finally met one, but he was congenitally deficient. What a pity. Oh. Chapter 102. Ninkei did not know that he had once again passed by a great lucky chance, nor did he know that he tore a piece of account book paper in the brothel and was seen by a divine talisman master, which led to the creation of the two famous chicken soup calligraphy and the woodcut rubbings of the Yen family. Now he was still the unknown young boss of the Lin 47th Street, the ordinary student who studied hard in the academy. When he woke up the next morning, he frowned and drank the bowl of chicken soup with great difficulty. Then he stopped Sang Sang, who was about to clean up the stove. Looking at the little handmaiden's black face, he said very seriously, "I drank too much last night because I was too happy. But I got drunk when I came back, so I didn't have time to tell you." Sang Sang raised her little face, raised her thin eyebrows, and looked at him curiously with her bright eyes. She asked, "Young master, what made you so happy? I really rarely see you drink so much. In the old library of the academy, I seem to have found a way to understand those books." Ning Ke smiled and held out a finger, shaking it in front of her little nose. He said, "Although it may only be a glimmer of hope, it is still hope. I think if possible I must seize it." The so-called hope was just an occasional denial of despair. Because it was only occasionally, it could not last long. As a guy who had been toyed with by fate for more than 10 years, Ning Ke knew better than anyone else that the end of hope would often turn into disappointment and then despair. The greater the hope, the deeper the regret, and regret in the end. Whether it was the cultivator in the mountains of the Yen territory, the examination officer of the military ministry, the gentle old man Liu Qingchen on the journey, or the magic skills selection of the academy, he had endured the painful process of hope being extinguished again and again. So he became calmer and even more numb. Even so, he seemed not to care much about stepping into that magical world of cultivation, but deep in his heart, he had never given up hope. Because he knew that if he wanted to survive in this world, to live well, to complete his revenge, to write his name on the fertile black soil of the Great Tang, he had to enter that world. If he gave up all hope, then the result would not be disappointment but despair. In order to grasp the faint glimmer of hope, Ning Ke adjusted his mental state to the most passionate and sunny state. Every morning he would leave Chang and City by car before dawn, and return to Lin 47th Street in the middle of the night. In the morning, he would often feel sleepy when he studied the 6 classics. When the bell rang for the 3rd time, he would jump up energetically as if he had been choked by Nandini's tobacco. He would rush out of the study room and into the kitchen. He would chew the lunch for 2 slowly and take a few laps around the lake. Then he would climb the stairs again and again, holding the book in his hand. Under the sun, he read the ink characters under the west window. He used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to disassemble all the characters in the thin book into individual strokes. Then, he would carefully experience the direction and meaning of those strokes and deliberately forget their meaning. The female professor was still quietly writing the hairpin-style small regular script by the east window. He did not know when she untied her hair bun, but the soft short hair above her ears reflected the growing spring scenery outside the window. She was extremely gentle and also extremely silent. No matter how sincere Ning Ke's attitude was, she refused to give any advice. After a few days in the afternoon, he finally flipped to the middle part of the book, a preliminary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. The ink characters reflected in his eyes were disassembled into thousands of strokes, and then reassembled into thousands of different shapes and inexplicable meanings of Yong. It almost completely exhausted his mental and physical strength. Ning Ke rubbed his sore eyes and silently turned his head to look at the increasingly fat green leaves outside the window. He knew that it was meaningless to force himself to continue reading. Even if he continued to squeeze out the last of his mental perseverance, it would only help him to understand more about the meaning of the talisman master who copied the book. It would not provide any help to him to step into the initial state. What disappointed him the most was that on the piece of paper in the middle of the thin book, there were no more notes left behind by that mysterious teacher. There wasn't even a word or two, as if that person had disappeared. The cicadas that had troubled the students of the academy for thousands of years began their cycle of reincarnation without warning in this afternoon. Ning Ke quietly listened to the noisy cicadas outside the window. After a long time, he suddenly turned his head and closed the thin book on his knees. Then, he closed his eyes and began to meditate. He used the 8 strokes calligraphy method of Yong to compose the meaning of the strokes, and then forcibly dispersed his mind to forget the meaning of the words. Therefore, although there were many strokes and they could barely stay in a corner of the spiritual world, once he began to meditate on these strokes, the complicated strokes would become dangerous. On the first day, when Ning Ke felt that the psyche power in his chest and abdomen had no way forward, He knew that it would be very dangerous to forcibly meditate on it. Therefore, he did not try it again these days. He only hoped that it was right in front of him in the human world. If he watched it slip away to the netherworld in the horizon, it was absolutely unacceptable to him. Therefore, he had to try again at this moment. He closed his eyes and sat cross-legged by the window, motionless for a long time like a statue. A warm spring breeze blew in from the west window and blew on his light green robe, causing ripples. Those traces slowly protruded on the surface of the green robe outside his chest and abdomen, and then calmed down. They protruded again and calmed down again, as if they had some kind of spirituality, or as if some wonderful life had come to life. It was a pity that those traces could not be connected after all. They were isolated in a corner and could not be touched no matter which direction they went. Their spirituality was blocked and life had no foundation. In a small pond in the academy, the lake water was gently disturbed by the wind, and the slight waves pushed a few small round duckweed on the surface to swing around. But no matter which direction the duckweed swayed to, it would eventually touch the wall of the pond and fall back. In a deep mountain somewhere in the world, a famous scholar went through the dense forest to visit a famous monastery. He knocked on the wooden door of a small temple, only to find that the great virtue-eminent monk had already traveled around the world. The famous scholar could only shake his head and climb up the stairs to retreat. He looked back at the broken road in the forest, feeling very resentful. In Ninkei's spiritual world at this moment, those extremely complicated strokes, those partial radicals that had been decomposed into no specific meaning, and those horizontal and vertical lines and ink spots, suddenly became vivid as he tried to meditate on them. The ink marks had sharp metal edges and became the frightening saber array of the golden tribe of the barbarians on the grassland. The tip of the brush was infinitely wet and became the cold rain outside the spring breeze pavilion. It began to fall. When it fell, countless heads were chopped off, and when it fell, it became a rainstorm. It was majestic and endless, only endless conflicts. All of a sudden, the whole world stopped. He suddenly opened his eyes and left the state of meditation. He felt a sharp pain in his chest and could not help but lower his head to cough. The slightly hoarse cough instantly broke the silence on the second floor of the old library. He hurriedly lifted his sleeve to cover his mouth, only to find that the sleeve was stained with some scarlet blood spots. The headmaster of the academy once said that doing things by force is a very boring thing. Your body is not suitable for cultivation. Although you have amazing perseverance and even found a very interesting way, but, since it is impossible, don't persist. Unknowingly, the female professor had already walked to Ninkei and said softly while looking at him with gentle eyes. Ninkei looked up and found that the female professor was extremely small, with thin eyebrows and clear eyes. He could not tell how old she was. He knew that in the previous dangerous moment, she must have used some method to forcibly call him out of meditation. He could not help laughing at himself, stood up, wiped the blood stains on the corner of his mouth, and sincerely bowed to her. The female professor smiled and shook her head, indicating that he did not need to be so serious. After slightly nodding, she walked to the depth of the bookshelf with a hairpin-style small regular script, and somehow got out of the old library. Unconsciously, Ninkei spent a lot of time meditating. It was already dusk outside the building. When the night was about to come, he did not hurry to leave, but quietly stood under the west window, listening to the intermittent chirping of cicadas due to lack of practice. Then he walked to the desk, ground the ink, and wrote a paragraph on the paper. Late at night, the talisman on the bookshelf in the depth of the second floor of the old library shone again, and then quietly slid to both sides. Accompanied by heavy gasps, Chun Pippi squeezed out with great difficulty, and his fat face was very funny with trembling flesh. After leaving those words that night, he had been concerned about Ninkei's progress. However, because Ninkei had asked for sick leave, he did not get a reply for several days, which made him angry and more curious. Unfortunately, second brother, who had given him the most headache and fear these days, suddenly asked his classmates to collectively learn the ancient ritual procedures. Under the continuous bombardment of fatigue, he had no time and energy to come over. Finally, Chun Pippi had some free time today. Without taking a bath and resting, he hurried to the old library, just to see if there was any reply from the poor and hateful guy. Walking to the bookshelf, Chun Pippi took out the thin primary exploration of Ocean of Chi and Mountain of Snow. He raised his thick eyebrows and made a slight sound. After reading it for a while, he could not help but shake his head in praise. This guy is really bold and ambitious. He actually came up with such a stupid method and can actually understand it? What he read was naturally Ninkei's first reply, and then he saw Ninkei's latest message today. His thick lips could not help but smack more loudly. He frowned and said in distress, "You don't even know this, and you still want to play cultivation? I really don't know whether you are a genius or an idiot." After a moment of silence, Chun Pippi sat at the desk by the west window, ground the ink and began to reply. In the second exchange between him and Ninkei, this genius student from West Hill wrote, "Are you a child? Don't you even know such a basic truth? Since you don't know anything, you naturally can't resonate with the breath of heaven and earth. There is no other way. If you want to know the specific reason, I can only give you an analogy. Our body is like a musical instrument such as a flute. Psyche power is the breath of heaven and earth in the flute. Beautiful music can't be played with the flute and the breath, because the sound comes from the holes of the flute. If there are no holes on your flute, how can you play? Heaven and earth can't hear your music, how can you sense it? There are so many acupoints in your ocean of chi and mountain of snow that are blocked. How do you still want to play? The computer network of the Austrian hotel is as bad as that of the German hotel. I tried my best to write it last night, but I just couldn't send it. Fortunately, I can now. Also, dear readers, it's going to be a long-distance flight back home soon. If I can write it on the plane, I won't stop updating tomorrow. If I can't write it on the plane, it will be terrible. I will confirm whether there is an update before 8 o'clock on the 19th and report to you by then. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 103. Morning. Morning. Have you finished copying the 3 teaching plans for today's calligraphy course? Not yet. I'm in a hurry. Then you guys have to hurry up. I heard that the teacher will give marks during the class. The marks will take up a large proportion of the semester exam. If we can't pass the exam, no one will be able to help us. The semester exam even counts the daily grades? I heard from my uncle that he was like that at that time. If Professor Wu wants to check who can memorize the 3,748 words of the Declaration of War against Yen, I'm sure I can't recite it. You'd better remind me of the beginning of the sentence. Of course. My problem is that I can't recite it even if you remind me of the words. In the early morning in front of the academy, the students came down from the horse carriages and greeted each other. The sun was shining in the sky, and birds were singing in the woods behind the courtyard. As the spring deepened and the summer approached, the temperature became higher and higher. The young students had already changed into the summer clothes of the academy. The clothes were soft and breathable, and their sleeves fluttered in the morning breeze, which made them look more free and fresh than usual. As usual, they began their daily life in this way. They seemed to be complaining and nervous, but secretly they were full of youthful confidence. Ninkei stood among his schoolmates and answered them with a warm smile. Looking at the excited expressions on their faces that had been forcibly wiped away, he could not help but feel that it was funny. He thought to himself that although the stars and moon were no longer here, some things were always so similar. The annual semester exam was one of the most important teaching ceremonies in the academy. Its importance was second only to the internship exam for Tang students and the final exam of the academy. How could the young and competitive students not take it seriously? Maybe those guys who complained last night that they had no time to review the teaching plans had stayed up until the early morning and only slept for a short while. Now they could recite the words fluently, but they had to deliberately show that they were relaxed and even lazy. The ordinary morning study began with Wu Chantian, the Academy's professor of literature, reading with a strong Jiaozhou accent. Although Wu Chantian was so impassioned when he read Wang Chongren's war declaration against Yen in the Changhua period, The students could not understand his accent, so the atmosphere in the school inevitably seemed a bit dull. In the end, the old professor wetted 3 handkerchiefs and half of his green sleeves, but all he got in return was the students' silent yawns. Fortunately, the old man did not ask his students to stand up and recite the denunciation against Yen at the last minute. He probably knew that he could still recite this extremely long denunciation after 40 years, but it was not suitable for him to use this standard to ask his students. When the bell rang for the 3rd time, Ning Kei finally felt relieved. He hastily packed his stationery and books and rushed out of classroom 3. He crossed the clear alley and stepped on the stone path along the edge of the wetland to the old library. Now that he used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to read books and forget the meaning, it was no longer like before when he would faint while reading. Therefore, he did not need to be so strict on food and rest. More importantly, he was very curious, or rather looking forward to the question he left yesterday. He wanted to know how the mysterious messenger would answer. Thump, 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 thump. Ning Kei went upstairs, brushed his clothes with his sleeves, and bowed respectfully to the gentle female professor by the east window. He quickly walked back to the bookshelf, took out the thin book A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow, and opened it as fast as he could. Pulling out the paper with dense handwriting, Ning Kei suppressed his excitement and looked at it, and then fell into a long silence. Our bodies are like musical instruments. For example, if it's a flute, psyche power is the qi that recovers in the flute. With the flute and the qi, it doesn't mean that beautiful music can be played, because the sound comes from the flute holes. If there are no holes on your flute, how can you play? Heaven and earth can't hear your music, how can you feel it? There are so many acupoints in your ocean of qi and mountain of snow that are blocked. What else do you want to do? Ning Kei looked at the message on the paper and raised his head after a long time. He shook his head and looked at the dense forest outside the window with a helpless smile. Listening to the sound of cicadas outside the window, he let out a very slight sigh and said, "It turns out that this is the truth. Turns out that I am a flute that can't be played." Then he looked down at his chest and abdomen. His eyes fell on the thin green academy uniform, and he imagined the ocean of qi and mountain of snow in his flesh and bones under the cloth. He seemed to see a lot of clumsy stone mountains that had no acupoints, no rugged paths, and no sound no matter how the waves beat or how the lake wind blew. The person who can write such words is really a genius. He couldn't help but look at the handwriting on the paper again and silently praised in his heart, using pushing down a woman to talk about the principle of reading books and forgetting the meaning, and then coming up with such a wonderful metaphor of playing a flute. If this person is an instructor, he must be the top instructor in the academy. While praising, Ning Kei inevitably felt a little gloomy when he thought of the lakeside stone mountain without acupoints in his body and himself, a stupid piece of wood that couldn't find a hole. He sighed and put the primary exploration of the ocean of qi and mountain of snow back on the bookshelf and began to walk among the bookshelves. Knowing the relationship between the acupoints in the ocean of qi and mountain of snow, psyche power and the breath of heaven and earth, and knowing that the congenital body constitution was limited, Ning Kei couldn't really step into that world even if he could use some stupid methods to look at the world and fulfill some wishes. Ning Kei felt that it was meaningless to continue reading books by reading words and forgetting the meaning, because for him, walking into that world was far more important than having a glimpse of that world from afar. He didn't want to disturb the female professor who was writing words in the east window, so he deliberately slowed down and lightened his steps when walking back and forth among the bookshelves. The expression on his face had become very calm, or it should be said that he seemed to be calm. His calm eyes gently swept over the densely packed cultivation books on the bookshelves. The titles on the spines of the books, which he felt were incomparably mysterious at first glance, were still a great temptation for him at this time, but also a very annoying torture. Suddenly he saw a book at the bottom corner of the second row of bookshelves. He subconsciously raised his eyebrows and looked a little surprised. There were countless precious and mysterious cultivation books hidden on this floor, but this book was definitely not the most remarkable one among them. But the name of this book reminded him of some past events. The name of this book was Wu Zhanyang's Theory on Howren's Sword. It was the words Howrun Sword that reminded Ninkei of the first cultivator he met on the battlefield in his life, the great swordmaster in a green robe who intended to kill Princess Liu at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. That great swordmaster was an abandoned disciple of the academy, and he cultivated in Howrun Sword. He squatted down and pulled out the book of Howrun Sword. After hesitating for a moment, he walked back to the wooden floor where he usually sat, and sat in the warm spring sunshine. After calming down for a moment, he opened the book. The cicadas outside the window were even louder, and the forest seemed more quiet. The rest of the students downstairs were either drowsy because of the cicadas, or they were all licking the tips of their pens to prepare for the semester exam in a month. Ninkei sat alone on the floor, sitting between the cicadas and the silence. All of a sudden, his face suddenly turned pale. He clenched his right hand into a fist and hit hard on his chest, forcibly shaking himself out of the state of meditation. He dared not look at the pages of the book again. He was still reading the book in the way of 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. Similarly, he also faintly felt that there was some kind of aura in his body, which flowed slowly in his chest and abdomen along with the strokes, and then disappointedly met the lake wall. But he did not expect that the words and strokes in this book of Wu Zhanyang's theory on Howrun Sword were so sharp that they did not turn back when they met the lake wall. Instead, they coldly and mercilessly stabbed forward with the aura in his body. It was this stab that made Ninkei feel as if a real cold sword was formed inside his body, and then pierced through his heart. The pain was so horrible that even he, who had been between life and death countless times and had been seriously injured many times, could not bear it when he was unprepared. If he were an ordinary person, he might scream at this moment and then fall to the ground with a pale face. Then he would be sent into the real world by the emptiness realm, twitching all over and fainting. But Ninkei was not an ordinary person. He had many similar or even more painful experiences than this one. When he was 11 years old, he took Sangsang through the vast Min Mountain for the umpteenth time. Once he lost his footing and fell off the cliff. Fortunately, he was stopped by a hard tree sticking out of the cliff, so he did not fall to his death. However, the tree's sword-like branches that stretched towards the sky directly pierced through his chest and back. Even with such heavy injuries, he still survived. Moreover, from that day onwards, there was no pain that could make him feel fear and despair. Ninkei, who was hanging from the branches on the cliff, was not dead. Ninkei, who was sitting on the floor under the sunlight, would not have any problems. He did not even let out a groan. He only panted a few times and then calmed down. He looked at the closed book again with a complicated expression on his face. He murmured in a low voice, "Pain leads to impassibility, and the passage leads to no pain. This is really an everlasting truth that has been passed down since ancient times." He shook his head and leaned back against the bookshelf. He raised his sleeve to cover his mouth and coughed twice, guessing that his lungs might have been injured by the Howrun sword hidden in the pages of the book. But strangely, he did not look depressed at all at this moment. Instead, there was a faint excitement. Pain leads to impassibility. So if I endure the pain and force my way through, naturally it will not hurt anymore, right? At this moment, Ninkei thought of the waterfall that seemed to be the Milky Way falling from the 9th heaven. He thought of the black oil gushing out from the wilderness. He thought of the broken fire hydrant and the beautiful bare-legged girl in a flowery skirt beside the fire hydrant. She looked nervous but was actually excited. He also thought of countless sages and sages in martial arts novels. Those fellows whose blocked meridians would be cleared after a nap. Those who lost all their power and slept in a tomb for a few years wrapped in unfinished silk. Those who became invincible after cutting themselves with a knife and severing their conception and governing vessels. Those who turned themselves into a great grandmaster of the one meridian after their meridians were all severed. Those who turned themselves into a great grandmaster of the one meridian. If those old guys and little guys could do it, why couldn't he? If those guys could succeed in the end because they all had some kind of stubbornness in their temperament, then would his stubbornness be less than theirs? Determination and arrogance flashed in Ninkei's clean eyes. He struggled to stand up with the help of the bookshelf and walked to the desk beside the west window. He ground the ink and moistened the brush. He left a message for that guy. I do understand the importance of impassibility. If Haotian is destined to make me impassibility for the rest of my life, then I have to do it myself. I finally came out before 12 o'clock. What's even better is that this chapter doesn't seem to need any major repairs. Excellent. I'll bow down and go to sleep. The day after tomorrow it's going to be midnight. Dear, I'm going to die. Oh dear. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 104. After class on the second day, the students in the study room did not leave with laughter as usual, but looked at the door of the study room one after another, looking puzzled and slightly surprised. Standing at the door were Xie Chongyun, Zhong Dajuan and several companions. They were students of grade A dormitory, and no one knew why they came here today. The academy had opened for more than a month, and the students gradually became familiar with each other, and the dormitories gradually became a group. Although there was no dispute among them for the time being, there would always be some relatively antagonistic mentality. Therefore, after seeing Xie Chengyun and Zhong Dajuan at the door, the students of classroom 3 were curious and somewhat vigilant. Xie Chengyun from the South Jin Kingdom had not gone upstairs these days, and his body had recovered well, and his face was no longer pale. He calmly faced the suspicious and vigilant eyes of the students of classroom 3, and slowly walked forward with his companions behind him. They walked to somewhere behind the study room, and then took out a letter from his sleeve and very seriously and solemnly handed it over. Ning Ke had been calmly looking at the door. He had thought that his target might be Jin Wucai or one of the Chong and noblewomen in the front row, and then there might be a romantic affair. He did not expect that he would go straight to the back of the study room, and his target turned out to be himself. After thinking for a while, he stood up and looked at him with a slight smile. Looking at the craft paper letter between his fingers, he asked, "Is this an invitation or does Xie Chengyun want to invite me to dinner?" Xie Chengyun glanced at Zhong Dajuan beside him, and then looked at Ning Ke seriously and calmly said, "It's not an invitation, but a letter of challenge. I want to have a gentleman's competition with you in the semester exam of the academy a month later, to see who can get the first place. Since it's a gentleman's competition, I won't take advantage of you. It's limited to the 3 courses above A in the academy entrance exam." In the academy entrance exam, Ning Ke's total score was not very eye-catching, but he got A+ in the 3 subjects of writing, archery and mathematics, which forcibly surpassed Xie Chengyun, Zhong Dajuan, Lin Chuan and Wang Ying. The so-called indignation and unwillingness probably started from that moment. Coupled with the sensational competition later, Xie Chengyun, a talent from the South Jin Kingdom who had been proud of his peers since childhood, had to admit that compared with this seemingly ordinary border town soldier, he seemed to be always losing. He came to the Tang Empire with the glory of his family, and even the South Jin Kingdom on his shoulders. He could not allow himself to keep losing. Zhong Dajuan and his other companions kept stirring things up, so he decided to find an opportunity to take back all the glory that once belonged to him. The semester examination of the academy was the best opportunity. Ning Ke was slightly startled, for he had never thought that it would be like this. For him, he had not come into contact with this game of using exam results to fight for his pride for many years. To be more precise, since he was severely taught by his mother with a mop in the 1st grade of primary school, he had always got full marks, and had never met a classmate who dared to challenge him in learning. More importantly, in this life, he was used to challenging on the edge of a knife and between life and death. Suddenly finding that these young classmates were still at this level, he could not help but feel a little childish and funny. Thinking of this, he could not help laughing. He looked at Xie Chongyun and wanted to say something, but found that he could not make it clear to such a son of an aristocratic family. A short silence and a gentle smile had different meanings in different people's eyes. Zhong Dajuan knew that Ning Ke was not a timid person, so he sneered and said, "Are you afraid?" Finding that the students of grade A dormitory came to send a letter of challenge, the students of grade C dormitory were shocked into silence at first, and then it turned into a whisper discussion. At this time, hearing Zhong Dajuan's sarcasm and provocation, Although the students of grade C dormitory were afraid of famous people like Xie Chengyun and Zhong Dajuan, they could not help but get angry and shouted, "Ning Ke, take this letter." Situi stood up and glanced at Ning Quebec. When she was about to say something, Ning Ke shook his head and stopped her. He naturally reached out to take the letter, looked at Xie Chengyun in front of him and asked, "Although it is not a duel of cutting sleeves or cutting palms, I think since you insist on using this childish and cute way to get back the lost dignity, you will definitely put forward the relevant bet about winning or losing." Then he added with a smile, "The bet can't be too excessive. If the loser wants to go to the old library to hug the big pillar and shout, 'I love Her Majesty,' then I will give up in advance." As soon as this remark came out, there was an exaggerated laughter in the study room. Xie Chengyun also laughed and said, "Since it is a gentleman's competition, what we want is nothing more than academic progress. The loser should treat the winner to a meal." The bet was nothing more than a meal. As the saying goes, it is raised high and then it is lowered gently. Behind Xie Chengyun, Zhong Dajuan heard that he suddenly changed the original bet, and could not help showing anger in his eyes. However, the students of grade C dormitory thought that Xie Chengyun's proposal was very graceful and had a better impression of him. Ning Ke shook his head indifferently and looked at Xie Chengyun with a smile. He said softly, "A gentleman's competition. If I don't accept your challenge, am I not a gentleman? Although I am not a gentleman and I don't want to be one, I think you are not a gentleman when you use words to force people to submit." Xie Chengyun slightly changed his expression and said nothing more. The challenge of Xie Chengyun, a talent of the South Jin Kingdom, caused a sensation among the academy students. The students of grade C dormitory were not in a hurry to go home or get a meal, but stayed excitedly, discussing and analyzing the possible results and giving suggestions for Ning Ke with a spirit of collectivism. Situ Ilan even came up with the idea of asking the sharpshooter of the military ministry to give Ning Ke special training again. Ning Ke himself looked very calm and natural, just smiled and apologized and left the study room. Compared with the great fear between life and death, other things were not so scary. If he acted solemnly, it would be in vain and make others laugh. For Ning Ke, who had experienced too many great fears between life and death, Xie Chengyun's serious challenge letter was such a funny childish trick. He accepted the challenge letter not because he wanted to review the past and regain the glory of winning the whole school list, but because he didn't have too much energy to say anything to these youthful classmates. Now his whole mind was on the top of the old library, on the humble mountain without aperture acupoints. He went upstairs again, bowed respectfully to the east window, and then walked to the west window. On the way, he stopped at the bookshelf and pulled out the thin book. After opening it, he found that there was no message from the mysterious man on the paper, so he regretfully sighed and put the book back. Then he pulled out Wu Zhanyang's theory on Howren's sword from the bottom of the bookshelf on the third floor, and began to read the book with his legs crossed. If Ning Ke was now lying in front of a steep and difficult mountain, then what he was doing now was what the foolish old man had done. Even if he couldn't climb over the mountain, he would forcibly dig a few ventilation tunnels from the middle. The foolish old man had stepped on many pairs of straw sandals and dug many holes to move the mountain. He was a guy with great perseverance. However, if he, who had no modern engineering knowledge, went to dig countless tunnels on both sides of the mountain, he would eventually be like a loach drilling through tofu, and helplessly dig a tofu dregs project that kept moving forward and collapsing. Even if he had the body of Vajra, it would be in vain for him to dig for thousands of years. It was a very beautiful wish that man could conquer nature, which could motivate human beings to keep moving forward at the spiritual level. But in specific cases, not everything could be completed perfectly by perseverance alone. Back to the foolish old man who was worshipped as an idol by Ning Ke and many male protagonists. When people questioned him, he said that his children and grandchildren were endless, but the mountain was always there, so one day it would be dug out. This sentence was very refreshing and vigorous, and vaguely in line with the true meaning of the headmaster's question of cutting peach blossoms and drinking wine. The so-called endless. However, the foolish old man didn't know a cruel truth. That was, the mountain would sometimes grow taller. In the next few days, the pen and ink were like swords stabbing directly into the chest. The Howren sword, which was disassembled by the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong, was like countless sharp swords, stabbing and stabbing in Ning Kei's body, and poking out countless invisible holes. However, those holes quickly collapsed, leaving no passage at all. In order to forcibly poke through those blocked passages, Ning Kei made great efforts, and his spirit and body were seriously exhausted. He didn't faint again, but with more and more times of meditation and forcibly mobilizing psyche power to break the mountain, his face became paler and paler, his throat became drier and his ears began to buzz, and the pain in his chest and abdomen was enough to kill countless talents like Xie Changyan. The injured lobe of his lungs began to affect his breathing, and his coughing at night became louder and more hoarse and unpleasant, so Sang Sang slept less and less. Finally, one morning he spat out a mouthful of blood. After being sent to the medical hall, the doctor looked at the lad with pity as if he was looking at a tuberculosis patient, and then casually prescribed some nourishing medicine, and told him to take a good rest and not to go to the brothel again. After receiving 20 taels of silver, he didn't say anything more. After paying such a big price, the mountain in Ning Kei's body, the humble mountain, and the snow mountain were still there in silence. It was really like watching him dig the mountain and the mountain collapsed, watching him move the mountain and the mountain didn't speak a word of contempt. One night, Chan Pippi finally finished the learning task of the ancient ritual and sacrificial process arranged by second brother, and came to the old library in the starlight again. When he opened the thin book and saw the sonorous and powerful declaration left by Ning Kei, he was so shocked that he almost cried out. With his fat lips trembling, he pointed at the words left by Ning Kei, and angrily scolded in a low voice, "Are you really an idiot? In this world, except for the West Hill Divine Palace using the great god's vanquishing skill and asking the light of Haotian to forcefully open people's acupoints, who else can go against heaven and change fate? You actually want to open your own acupoints. You are so arrogant and stupid." Thinking of the long-lost Peach Mountain in West Hill, Chan Pippi was even more angry, and shouted, 3 great divine priests have to spend half of their lifetime to use the great god's vanquishing skill. Now who in this world is worth such a big price for the divine hall? I was just fed a few heavenly power pills in those days. He felt sorry for Ning Kei's misfortune, and angry for his blind struggle. While angry and angry, he waved the pen on the paper and finished, "If one can open their acupoints easily, then everyone in this world is a cultivator. Idiot. 6 hours 3,000 words like sh*t. My brain has become an idiot. Fortunately I have written it out. Tomorrow at the same time I will try to move this mountain. The chapter name is not bad. By the way, I recommend the beans Poisonous Fairy. I am sh*t. Good night. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 105. Gently patting his cheeks and rubbing his hands, Ning Kei pulled himself together and went upstairs. After greeting the female teacher, he waved his hand to drive away the cicadas and took out the thin book from the bookshelf. Full of expectations, he looked at the new handwriting on the paper, and could not help raising his eyebrows and feeling gratified. However, after a while, his eyebrows could not help but droop with some annoyance. The mysterious guy's message rudely and even coldly pierced all the hopes he had these days. It could even be said that the more he suffered, the more he felt that the door was right in front of him. It directly told him that no one in the world could enlighten the acupores by themselves, and all those who tried to do so were dead. Will people die? What about those guys from the Devil's Doctrine? Ning Kei muttered to himself with eyes full of disappointment. He thought to himself, since the gray-haired man said that everyone could be the god of cookery, why can't everyone be a cultivator? After a long silence, he finally decided to give up reading Wu Zhanyang's theory on Howren's sword. Because of many reasons, Ning Kei could be strong and persevering to move the mountain, regardless of the difficulties and obstacles he might face. However, courage and perseverance were not the same as stubbornness and stone-like stubbornness. Although he still did not know who the mysterious message was and what his identity in the academy was, he firmly believed that the person must be a cultivation genius who had a far better understanding of cultivation than himself. Since the other party said that people would not die from forcibly enlightening the acupores, then it would be very dangerous for him to move the mountain blindly. A wise man is good enough to be my teacher, and it is wise to listen to others' advice. Ning Kei's rational thinking made him decide to temporarily stop using the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to break the characters, but he was still inevitably disappointed. Before leaving the old library, he could not help but write a paragraph with the brush pen and ink. I won't read it today, but I will continue to read it tomorrow. I am not reading the primary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow now, but I am reading Wu Zhanyang's theory on Howren Sword. You can leave me a message there. Besides, I have one last question. If most people in the world cannot sense the breath of heaven and earth because of different physiques, if this is the fate that Haotian gave to each of us, then isn't it too unfair for Lord Haotian? Late at night, Chun Pippi appeared in the old library again. He looked out the window at the dark night sky covered by clouds and took out the book and the piece of paper from the bookshelf. After reading it, he couldn't help but laugh angrily. His round chubby cheeks were full of resentment. He thought to himself that the tone of this kid's messages was getting more and more impolite. He obviously wanted something from him, but the tone of the message sounded like he was ordering him to do something. He really didn't know where this idiot came from. Although he was thinking this way, he panted and squatted down to pull out Wu Zhanyang's theory on Howren Sword from the bottom of the bookshelf. Then he walked to the west window and began to reply to Ning Kei's message. As the most brilliant genius student in the academy in recent years, Chun Pippi could only attend classes and study under the pressure of those horrible senior brothers after he entered the second floor. He had no chance to play his hobby of being a teacher. That night when he saw Ning Kei's emotional message, he accidentally replied to it. He was concerned about it and wanted to see if the poor guy could make a breakthrough. He also wanted to satisfy himself. As the saying goes, helping people is also addictive. Chun Pippi did not know the name of the poor guy, whether he was a man or a woman, old or young, but since he had helped him from the beginning, it was like the mud in the wetland in front of the building. It was hard to get rid of once it got stuck to your hands. It was purely a psychological problem. The next day, Ning Kei went to the old library and directly took out the book of Howren Sword. Then he saw the mysterious man's message and 2 lines of extremely arrogant words on the paper. He could not help but rub his eyebrows and smile bitterly. There is no such thing as fairness in this world. Lord Haotian is like the sunshine on the snow mountain. He will always pity the lotus above the clouds and is too lazy to look at the grass in the cracks of the rocks at the foot of the mountain. For example, I am the unique genius in the world. And you are a poor guy who can't cultivate because all the acupoints in your body are blocked. So what you, a grass, should do now is not to doubt all this, but to accept all this. Ning Kei took the thin paper and murmured, "The unique genius in the world? What a cocky guy." He became more and more suspicious of the mysterious man's identity. Judging from the man's choice of words and sentences, he was not like those old and virtuous professors in the academy, but more like the precious orchids growing in the greenhouse since childhood like Mr. Xie and Zhong Dajuan. But this person was obviously several levels higher than Xie Chongyun and others, because when he said that he was a genius, his tone seemed to be so natural, like the absolute truth that had been proved countless times by the world and time. For example, water flowed to the bottom, the hot and sour noodle slice soup was delicious, and Sang Sang was hardworking. However, Ning Kei had never been willing to lag behind others when it came to self-confidence. He had never been arrogant in front of a crowd or among his classmates. That was because he believed that he had long passed that age, and that it was inappropriate and childish for him to act like that. However, it did not mean that he had the slightest doubt about his own ability. Since childhood, he had been writing all over the school's double role. From kindergarten's various interest classes to Olympiad math class, he had been invincible in the new China's education system. He was a freak and a good student. He absolutely believed that he was the real genius. So he answered in this way today. There's no need to argue about the lotus and grass, but what I want to say is that if there really is a unique genius in this world, then this genius can only be me, and not you, because only I have the qualifications to be that one and only one. In this case, I have another question. Since you said that Lord Haotian will only pity the real genius, And since I am the real genius, why can't I cultivate? The West Hill Divine Kingdom, which had the most believers, the most unworldly sublime beings, and the most wealth and power, naturally had many geniuses. In the depths of the ruined temple, in front of the 7 tomes of arcane, there were many geniuses. The Tang Academy, which had the most revered status in the world, had the most hermits, and had people like the headmaster of the academy, naturally had many geniuses. Behind several stone statues on the 2nd floor, there were many wise men who lived peacefully. Chan Pippi, who had just lived a short 16 years, had already studied in these 2 places for many years. From the attitude of his teachers and the eyes of his classmates, he had long confirmed that he was the most outstanding genius in the cultivation world. Even if he met the other 2 guys from the unknown place, he still had enough capital to be proud. So he did not think that his usual attitude and message to the guy was too proud, because it was just a simple statement of fact. Now he finally met a guy who was prouder and more confident than him. The problem was that in his opinion, the guy who claimed to be the one and only genius was just a pitiful person who didn't even know what cultivation was. He only had some perseverance and tricks. Well, Chun Pippi admitted that the guy was smart and persistent, but what made him compete with him for the word genius? In his anger, he wrote wildly with the help of the dim starlight through the clouds and the angry cicadas outside the window. He gave Ningke a question in his message. You use the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to break the characters and use such a stupid method to read the book and forget the meaning. I guess the sword aura must have hurt your heart and lungs when you read the Howren sword. Then let me ask you, how should you treat the heart and lungs? Don't talk about the dirty medicine such as Qian Saozi. I only ask you, how do you boil mugwort and mugwort? How many times do you boil the fire? How to deal with Angelica dehurica and ginkgo? Slice or grind? How to dose red ginseng and brown sugar? How to mix it? When is the green fruit and green wormwood tonic? You answer me. Mugwort and mugwort, Angelica dehurica and white fruit, red ginseng and brown sugar, green fruit and green wormwood. Ningke looked at the scribbled messages on the paper, and imagined the look of the guy who should be very young when he wrote furiously. He could not help but raise his eyebrows and feel that this matter was really too interesting. It was not surprising that the guy left a question to test him, but he did not expect that the question left by the guy had nothing to do with the 6 subjects of cultivation, such as how many sword styles could be seen when the characters were broken down in the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. Instead, he asked about the way of medicine. In an instant, he understood the intention of the guy. The guy thought that he was a unique genius in cultivation, so it was naturally a little unfair to test him with questions about cultivation. Therefore, he simply chose a question that had nothing to do with the 6 subjects of cultivation. It was a question about how to choose and decoct medicine. The reason why the other party chose this question was very clear, and it was also very proud. The so-called genius was an all-rounder who was well-versed in every field. Using a cultivation question to test you doesn't count as a skill, but using the problems you encountered on your own will be enough to stump you to death. What a prideful fellow! Ningke smiled and shook his head, and then his smile suddenly disappeared. Because he really did not know how to solve this question and how to mix and decoct those familiar medicines to cure his lung injury. The doctor in Chong and City only told him to take good care of himself after receiving 20 taels of silver from Sang Sang. Although he was used to treating wounds with herbs in Min Mountain, he really did not know how to treat his lung injury and how to treat those medicines. Those who are not competitive usually disdain to be competitive. Have you ever seen the young Wang Bo argue with his peers about the different ways to write the Chinese characters? Have you ever seen Lin Jing at the age of 17 compete with her classmates at the Huagang Art School for a man's affection? But if the young Wang Bo met Gan Luo, or the 17-year-old Lin Jing met Sun Yaowei, now that Ningke met a proud guy who claimed to be a genius and was very likely to be a real genius, he naturally wanted to compete with him. But unfortunately, he really did not know how to answer this question. I really can't answer your question, he replied shamefully on the paper. Then he raised his eyebrows and the freckles on his face lit up. He tightened his right hand holding the brush and wrote on the paper, but to be fair, I also have a question for you. I don't know if you can answer it. 201110232230 modification, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 106. Under the starlight, there was a piece of paper, 2 pieces of paper, 3 pieces of paper on the table by the west window. Chonpipi's eyes widened as he looked at the densely packed small characters on the paper. He felt his scalp tingle and wondered what kind of title this was. There were actually 3 whole paragraphs of characters written on it. Subconsciously, he began to read from the beginning. Haotian's light shines on the world, and cares for all living creatures like a cattle herder. If you think you are a little smart, you can try to calculate the number of cattle herded by Haotian. The cattle gather in the Kaiping market in the north of the Tang Empire. They are divided into 4 groups and pass through the city gate to leisurely graze on the grassland of the barbarians. The first group is as white as silk, the second group is shining with black luster, the third group is brown and yellow, and the fourth group is colorful. There are males and females in each group, and there are many and few of them. Let me tell you the proportion of the bulls in each group. The number of white bulls is equal to the number of brown bulls, plus 1/3 and half of the number of black bulls. In addition, the number of black bulls is equal to 1/4 and 1/5 of the number of colorful bulls, plus all the brown bulls. When the brown bulls and colorful bulls are together, they form a triangle and no bull dares to break in. Please tell me the exact number of cattle in each group, and add an explanation. I solved this question when I was 7 years old. In the following time, Chonpipi stared at the dense ink marks on the paper, and began to bite the pen, scratch his head and hair, smash his legs, pursed his lips, gasped, licked the pen tip, began to calculate, gave up, and then continued to bite the pen, scratch his head and hair, smash his legs, pursed his lips, gasped, and cursed in a low voice. He did not leave until late at night. The back mountain of the academy was shrouded in a faint mist in the early morning. The stone square was surrounded by a few thin fences, and one could faintly hear the sound of roosters pecking at their food nearby. Occasionally, there were some voices of reading and questioning coming from the school deep in the stone square. The fog gradually dispersed, and Chonpipi dragged his fat body out. His eyes were bloodshot after staring for a whole night, and his hair, which was usually tied up tightly, was fluffy and messy like a pile of grass pulled by a chicken. He looked extremely embarrassed, not like a poor child who had been scolded by his mother for a whole night, but more like a poor child who had been scolded by his mother with a stick. Chonpipi walked to the door of the school and listened to the questions being asked inside. Thinking of his usual arrogance, he couldn't help but feel ashamed. However, the urge to solve the question won over the possible humiliation. He gritted his teeth and pushed the door open. Without looking around, he respectfully bowed to the people around him. A moment later, a few shocked and mocking laughter rang out in the study room. There are actually math problems in this world that our junior brother doesn't understand? Even a genius like you can't solve this problem. How can we solve it? Pippi, don't be naughty. At this moment, a person appeared at the door of the study room, and the laughter in the room suddenly stopped. Everyone, including Chonpipi, quickly stood up and bowed respectfully, saying, "Greetings, second brother." The person who was addressed as second senior brother was tall, wearing a rather ancient hat and an ordinary summer uniform of the academy. However, there was a satin belt woven from golden threads tied around his waist. He had dashing eyebrows and handsome eyes, and his expression was solemn and square. His entire body exuded an air of strict observance of etiquette. Standing there, he seemed as unshakable as a palace. The season of the year is in spring. It's still the end of spring, and it's not summer yet. You're already lax again. The season of the year is in the morning. Now it's just morning, and you're already laughing and joking again. How improper. Everyone knew that second brother had such a proud and polite temperament, and they were even more nervous when facing him than when facing the headmaster of academy and eldest brother. Fortunately, they had long been used to such clichés, so they didn't take it seriously and just responded with a smile. Chonpipi couldn't pretend to be stupid. He smiled awkwardly, tidied up his messy scalp as fast as he could under the stern gaze of second brother, and pulled his wrinkled uniform hard. Then he coughed twice and walked forward. handing the pieces of paper in his hand to second brother very respectfully. You got a plus in 6 subjects in the academy entrance exam. And there are math problems that you can't solve? Second brother took the 3 pieces of paper with a slight frown and glanced at them. They said the same sentence, but it was not to laugh at Chun Pippi, but to be a little confused. Who made the problem that embarrassed a genius like youngest brother to this extent? After quickly reading the problems on the paper, second brother frowned more and more, and his thin lips curled up. After a long while he said, Who made the damn problem? The algorithm is too troublesome and I don't know how long it will take to figure it out. I'm going to study ancient rites these days, and I don't have time to play with you. You can figure it out yourself. After saying this, second brother flicked his sleeves, put his hands on the golden silk belt around his waist, and proudly turned to leave the study room. He went straight to the direction of the fog-shrouded fence outside the door. The study room was silent, and all the students looked at second brother's back in astonishment. They thought that second brother, who hid his absolute pride with seriousness, would also use this method to avoid a fight? Thinking of second brother's usual serious behavior, some people wanted to laugh, but immediately raised their hands to cover their mouths, for fear that second brother would hear their laughter. Chun Pippi looked at second brother's gradually disappearing back, and his expression became even uglier. His fat face twitched and undulated, and he ran to the door and cried, "Senior brother, you should at least give me some ideas." At this time second brother slowly walked out of the stone platform with strict and square steps, like an emperor on the stage. Hearing Chun Pippi's pleading, he didn't look back, but raised his hand impatiently and angrily rebuked, "I said I won't figure it out, so I won't. I don't know how big the number of this damn problem will be. Not to mention Kaiping Market, even the whole Tang Empire can't put down so many cows. I'm curious about where Haotian's ranch is. Well, I admit that I can't figure out this damn problem, but I don't believe you can, especially when you were 7 years old. Unless you tell me the answer immediately, I will think that you are acting shamelessly. To tell you the truth, acting shamelessly to me in the academy, especially to someone who is angry out of shame today, will cause very serious consequences. This is not a warning, but a friendly reminder." Next to the table by the west window, Ning Kei's right foot stepped on the chair, and his right arm rested on the windowsill, supporting his chin. He read that guy's message with great interest, and his eyebrows raised proudly from time to time. When he saw the 4 words "angry out of shame," he couldn't help laughing out loud, which made the female professor by the east window frown and look at him. Ning Kei hurriedly sat up straight, and then continued to read that guy's message. He didn't know who was the person who was angry out of shame in the message, and thought that it was just an excuse to save face. If he knew that the person who was angered by his Archimedes ox-splitting problem was the legendary second brother of the second floor, he didn't know whether he would laugh more happily or break out in a cold sweat. As for the guy's accusation of acting shamelessly, Ning Kei didn't care at all. As a former problem-solving patient with Stockholm Syndrome, he knew very well the pain and annoyance of looking at a problem and not being able to find the answer. The guy's accusation was nothing more than an urgent need to know the answer. Do you want to know the answer to this problem? It's very simple. First tell me the answer to your medicine decoction problem, and then we will call this a draw. If you are not convinced, we can continue later. Outside the window, the spring scenery was in its last bloom, and the young cicadas were desperately chirping. Ning Kei shook his head and chuckled. He rolled up his sleeves, poured water into the pot, ground the ink and put the brush on the inkstone. Then he wrote the above words on the paper. On the night of the second day, the horse carriage left the academy, passed through the Vermilion Bird Gate in the south of Chang'an, and drove to Lin 47th Street in the eastern city. It stopped in front of the old brush pen shop. Ning Kei turned around and thanked the coachman before walking into the shop. The shop door was closed, and Sang Sang came out with a bowl of hot and sour noodle slice soup left in the morning. She put it in front of Ning Kei along with chopsticks and a towel, and then took out a plate of vinegar-soaked cabbage head and a plate of cold mixed with 3 kinds of shredded vegetables from under the table. After studying hard in the academy for a whole day, Ning Kei had to eat leftovers and pickled vegetables at home. He thought to himself, anyway, We are people with 2,000 taels of silver. How can we treat ourselves so harshly? If it were any other day, he might have directly taught the little handmaiden a lesson. However, he was in a good mood today, so he just shook his head and picked up the chopsticks to eat with relish. He also asked a few questions about the shop's business today. Sang Sang had already eaten in the afternoon, and now she was sitting beside him. Her thin arms were placed on the table, and her dark little face was resting on her arms. She tilted her head and stared at Ning Kei's face with her willowy eyes. After a while, she asked curiously, "Young master, are you in a good mood today?" "Yes." Ning Kei picked up a piece of blackened cabbage head and threw it into his mouth. He chewed it and frowned painfully because of the sour taste. He answered vaguely, "Recently, I met a very interesting guy in the academy." Sang Sang heard that he had made a new friend in the academy and smiled happily. She tilted her little face and asked with concern, "Is it a classmate? Is it a man or a woman?" Ning Kei looked at the little handmaiden's face and was slightly startled. He moved the tip of his chopsticks in the warm hot and sour noodle slice soup. After a while he hesitated and said, "I haven't seen him before, but he should be a man?" "No." Thinking of the obscene metaphor the first time he left the message, he shook his head and said resolutely, "It shouldn't be. That guy must be a man, and he must be a wretched, wretched man who has suffered many times at the hands of women." Wretched and wretched. Sang Sang began to think and wrinkled her nose. They don't seem to be the same thing. Wretched is his experience. Wretched is his temperament. Ning Kei explained seriously. Sang Sang sat up and asked curiously, "Does it mean that he is ugly? As I said just now, I haven't seen him." Ning Kei took out a piece of paper from his arms and handed it to her. He said, "There are several herbs on the paper, as well as the method of decocting and cutting them. Go to the pharmacy tomorrow to get the herbs, and then come back to fix it yourself. Remember, don't let others see it." Sang Sang took it and asked with a frown, "Why can't others see it?" Ning Kei thought of the guy who left him a message in the old library and couldn't help laughing. He said, "If I am right, that guy should be a student of the second floor of the academy. This prescription must be an exquisite secret prescription from the second floor. Since you and I have secretly taken advantage of that guy, it is better not to let others know." Note: this question is about Archimedes dividing the cow. Because it is too long, I can't write it all out. If I did, it would be too easy for me to write this chapter. Haha. You can find out by searching on Google. My understanding of mathematics is just like Ning Kei's understanding of cultivation. There are many things that I don't understand. If there are any problems, and if there are students who study mathematics, you can just release me like that kind of gas. This is also the first disclaimer of Zhang Yi. 201110232441 revised. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 107. People were coming and going downstairs of the old library, but it was quiet upstairs as usual. The books on the shelves were old thread-bound cultivation books, and the thin paper used by academy students was common. A brush, ink, and an inkstone were quietly placed on the table by the west window. The female professor sat quietly under the east window, and the lad sat cross-legged on the floor, thinking hard. Occasionally, he would get up and write a few sentences on the paper, and then put them into the book. At night, another fat lad came quietly, and after seeing the messages, he would go to the west window and write a few sentences or a long speech. Ning Kei and Chun Pippi, who did not know each other's identity, kept communicating by leaving notes. The late spring and early summer quietly slipped away as they wrote and laughed. It was peaceful and beautiful. Brother John Doe, is there any way to make the sword style in the book more gentle? Idiot, if it could be gentle, how could it be called sword style? Besides, the math question about the meadow and the cow yesterday was too weird. What is the relationship between quantity? Idiot, don't call everything you don't understand weird. Besides, is there really no way to open the acupoints? I still don't believe that Master Haotian would be so unfair to a genius like me. There is indeed, but you still shouldn't have any hope. There is only a fine line between a genius and an idiot. Anyone who has such hope, whether he is a genius or not, will become a poor idiot in the end. Besides, I still have to repeat that the math question you asked the day before yesterday was really a bit weird. It was not simple and beautiful. I heard that the devil's doctrine used a different method. They did not seek to resonate with the breath of heaven and earth, but tried to absorb the breath of heaven and earth into the body. There are no acupoints in the body. Can you use this method to step into the path of cultivation? Besides, here is the third math question I gave you. Please try to solve it seriously, and don't always ask for the answer from me. This question is just for beginners. Are you trying to humiliate me? As for the devil's doctrine, I have to warn you. It's okay in the academy, but don't mention it outside. Otherwise, you'll be chased by all the righteous powerhouses in the world. Besides, I have to tell you with a smile that even the devil's doctrine's cultivation method of absorbing heaven and earth into one's body requires all the acupoints to be connected. Only then can the breath of heaven and earth flow into one's body. This is really regrettable. I thought there would be other paths to take. You can think of using the 8 strokes of calligraphy of Jung to solve the characters. You are also a guy who takes an unconventional approach. I am really worried that you will be forced to cultivate the devil's path. So you should not feel sorry but feel lucky. Otherwise, if you fall into the devil's path, maybe I may have to cut you into 3 halves with my sword in the future. You're right. I feel very disappointed. By the way, we are considered pen pals, right? Why don't you ever ask me who I am? Aren't you curious at all? Don't you think it's a great opportunity to get to know this genius? I have never been curious about other people's affairs. Besides, you have never asked me who I am. Well, who are you? Where are you from? Which dormitory in the academy? Do you have any beautiful sisters at home? My name is Ning Quebec. I come from the city of Wei, classroom 3 of the academy. There is only a little black handmaiden at home. Who are you? Where are you from? You already have a fierce wife and concubine at home. Is that why you hate women so much? My name is Chun Pippi. I come from West Hill. Then that's it. I heard that a candidate from West Hill got an A+ in 6 subjects 5 years ago. All the instructors of the academy came out to watch because that was the best result in 100 years. Is that person you? Yes, it is. Do you have a feeling of awe and admiration for me now? I got 3 A+ in 3 subjects, 2 D+ in 2 subjects, and 1 abandoned. It is said that it is also a unique result in the academy in 100 years. In that case, why should I admire you? It's easy to get 3 A+ in 3 subjects. You can get 2 D+ in 2 subjects and 1 abandoned. It is really a rare and fierce level. You win. I temporarily admit that you are qualified to talk to me as an equal. You are from West Hill. Why did you come to the Tang Empire to study? I come from a big family in West Hill. You can't imagine how big the family business is. You know, a genius like me is destined to inherit the family property when I was born, but the problem is that I have an equally talented elder brother, who is just a little bit inferior to me. More importantly, this elder brother has been treating me extremely well since I was very young, taking care of me and doting on me and everything. He has never complained about the elders of the clan deciding to let me inherit the family property. I didn't want to inherit the family business at all. I thought my brother was the best candidate to inherit the family business. But the elders in the family didn't allow me to refuse. The longer I stayed in the West Hill, the better my brother treated me, and the more uncomfortable I felt. So I sneaked out when I was 10 years old. Sneaked out when you were 10 years old. Didn't your elders look for you everywhere? How could they not? Since they couldn't find me, they must have guessed that I was hiding in the academy. What about you? Why did you enter the academy? Why did you work so hard a few days ago? I entered the academy because I wanted to be an official of the empire. Of course, I wanted to cultivate more. As for why I worked so hard, it was because I had a lot of things to do. If I didn't work hard now, I might lose my life in the future. What could be so troublesome? That's because I can't tell you the story, you know. They exchanged notes on the paper beside the west window of the old library. At the beginning, they asked each other about cultivation and mathematics. Gradually, they became curious about each other's lives. As time passed, Ning Kei, who had used the prescription, quickly recovered and stopped coughing. The two young people, who had never met each other, became more and more familiar with each other. As the summer approached, the temperature became higher and higher. The west window had been closed, shrouding the building in darkness. Ning Kei looked at the notes left by that guy these days, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He found a shocking detail. That guy called Chan Pippi said that if his family couldn't find him, they must have guessed that he was hiding in the academy. This indirectly indicated that there was no place in the world that the guy's family couldn't find. Only a sacred and remote place like the academy could make that family afraid. In the West Hill Divine Kingdom, how could there be such a powerful family? He frowned slightly and thought for a moment, but still couldn't figure it out. Then he continued to read. Yesterday afternoon, he had asked if they could meet in the letter for the first time. Now that he was sure that Chan Pippi was on the second floor, he was naturally curious about the reply in the letter. On the paper was someone's handwriting from last night. When you can enter the second floor, you will naturally see me. Ning Kei shook his head and replied with his pen. The problem is, how can I enter the second floor? Hao Tian's unfairness had blocked all the acupoints in the young lad's body. No matter how he tried to read books in a deconstructive way, or to move mountains and dig holes with a fearless spirit, he had never really taken a step forward on the road of cultivation. At this time, looking at the word second floor, he inevitably felt a little sad. He put down his pen and stood up to look at the quiet bookshelves around him. He laughed at himself and sighed softly, thinking that it was really interesting and boring to stand on the second floor and think about where the second floor was. Suddenly, he frowned slightly. He noticed that there was a shallow scratch on the ground below the bookshelf that was leaning against the mountain wall not far away. The scratch on the dark-colored wooden floor was extremely faint. If one did not look carefully, it would be hard to notice. After a moment of silence, Ning Kei walked over and squatted down to touch it with his fingers, confirming that it should be the result of years of friction. He looked up at the heavy bookshelf, and his fingers that were pressing on the scratch slightly trembled. On both sides of the bookshelf, there were some complicated patterns that were difficult to understand. The patterns were greasy over the years, suddenly round and suddenly square without any specific shape, looking extremely ugly. Every detail of the flying eaves and carved rafters of the old library was extremely exquisite, but the patterns on the bookshelf facing the wall were so crude. He felt more and more strange. He slowly touched it with his fingers, and then closed his eyes to feel every kind of touch coming from his fingers. Could it be that the legendary second floor was behind the bookshelf? Could it be that the Real Academy was behind the wall? You can try to pry open the bookshelf and see what is behind it. Ning Kei suddenly opened his eyes and turned around. He found that the gentle and small female professor had quietly come behind him, and was looking at him with a gentle and even a little encouraging eyes. He didn't know the real meaning of the gentle and quiet eyes of the female professor. He glanced at the patterns on the bookshelf with a bitter smile. Occasionally, something flashed in his mind. He remembered how he felt when he saw the vermilion bird on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, and when he saw the animals on the eaves in the palace. He vaguely guessed something and dared not to do anything disrespectful. It was now midsummer in the 13th year of the Tianqi era. Ning Kei and Sang Sang had been in the magnificent city of Chang, and for several months. They opened the old brush pen shop and successfully entered the academy to study. They ate leftovers every day, as if nothing had changed in their lives. But in fact it was not so. The young soldier from the border town followed someone to fight for a night in the spring rain. He entered the palace once and fought hard with those cultivation classics in the old library for several days and nights. He saw a bigger and more magnificent world and got to know some interesting people. Both his vision and spirit were much different from before. Most importantly, in these few months, he had sent away his first friend, killed the censor Zhang Yiqi and Chan Zixian, and taken the first step on the path of revenge. Fortunately, the death of these two people did not seem to have alerted the Tang Empire's officials and the powerful General Xiahou. It's too hot. That's the bad thing about Chang'an. Lying on the bamboo chair and looking at the stars above, Ning Kei wiped the sweat off his face and shook his head. He said, The weather will only be cooler in the morning. There is a small lake beside the tea specialist's house. Do you think it will be more comfortable than here? Sang Sang took the towel and soaked it in the bucket of cold water. She said in a low voice, "Young master, are you going to kill him just because his house is cooler? Revenge? Is it really that interesting?" 2011-102-3250 revised. 3 chapters have been written. 3 chapters have been revised. Please vote for me. I've just started moving the mountain, and I really need everyone's help to stimulate me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 108. Chang'an was a city that had no regrets, except for its summer. In June, the sun was getting brighter and brighter, and the temperature was getting higher and higher. The hot summer air enveloped the streets and alleys. Occasionally, the wind would blow with a disgusting warm breath, wilting the originally green and plump leaves, staining the grapes on the racks purple, bringing out the ice cubes from the houses of the nobles, and pushing open the doors and windows of the commoners. All the doors and windows of the shops along the street of Lin 47th Street were open. Compared to the risk of theft, the risk of dying from heat stroke was obviously more terrifying. The poor manservants and waiters sat on the stone steps and looked around weakly, guarding against the thieves who had also stayed at home to enjoy the cool air. The shopkeepers and the masters moved bamboo chairs and water buckets to an alley behind the street. The alleys were quiet and narrow, shaded by green pagoda trees. There was not much sunlight during the day, and the night wind was much faster because of the narrow alleys, which made people feel relatively cool when it blew on them. All kinds of bamboo beds and small square tables had completely blocked the narrow alleys behind the street. The neighbors were lying on the bamboo beds and chatting lazily, with fruits soaked in well water on the small square tables beside them. There were also those who were used to finding joy in bitterness. They dug into their bowls of oily noodles, the sweat from the chili mixed with the sweat from the stuffy heat. They used the trick of fighting poison with poison to deceive themselves that the night was not that unbearably hot. From time to time there would be a clear smack in the alleys. It sounded like an adult was educating a naughty child, but in fact, it was just people patting their greasy and sweaty backs with towels soaked in well water. You can't. Do you still want to find someone to warm your feet on such a hot day? The couple in the fake antique shop argued day after day about taking a concubine. The people on Lin 47th Street had long been tired of hearing it, and even began to wonder if it was a kind of flirtation. There was also a back door at the back street of the old brush pen shop. It had not been used for a few days, but now it was finally put to use. Ning Ke lay on the bamboo chair and took the wet towel from Sang Sang. He sighed and wiped his naked upper body, listening to the quarrel coming from the bamboo bed next door. He thought that the life of the common people was not as interesting as what scholars said. Since it was boring, he decided to leave. He put the wet towel on his shoulder, got up and said goodbye to his neighbors before returning to his own courtyard. Sang Sang followed him with a bucket in one hand and a bamboo recliner in the other. Today, the little handmaiden was wearing a thin blue floral blouse. Her arms and legs were bare, and her tanned face was flushed. Her body was too cold to sweat, but it did not mean that she could not feel the heat inside and outside the eaves. On the contrary, it made her feel more annoyed. She looked at Ning Ke by the well and asked, "Young master, can I take off my outer blouse?" Ning Ke fetched a bucket of fresh cold water from the well, and was about to pour it on his head to get rid of the annoying heat. Suddenly, he heard her words and could not help but feel more annoyed. He turned his back and lectured her. "Although you are young, you are still a girl. How can you take off your clothes in front of a man? You are not 3 or 4 years old anymore. I can wipe your body and take a bath for you. You are about to become a big girl. Wake up, will you?" Sang Sang stared at him angrily and asked, "Young master, you didn't answer me just now. Is revenge really so interesting? Killing one every few days? Don't you find it boring?" "This is an interesting and irrelevant thing. Ninkei replied. We are eating leftovers every day. We have to go to the toilet every day. Isn't it boring and repetitive? But you still have to do it. Because if you don't eat, you will starve to death. If you don't poop, you will suffocate to death. Killing for revenge is boring, but in order to live in peace, no matter how boring it is, you still have to kill. After saying this, he raised his hands and flipped them over. The entire bucket of slightly cold well water splashed onto his body, and then poured onto the stone floor of the small courtyard. His spirit was immediately refreshed, and then he found that his lower body was slightly cold. He looked down in surprise, and saw that the cotton shorts he was wearing had actually been washed down by a section. Sang Sang looked at his exposed buttocks and the tight trousers around his buttocks. She giggled, which was rare for her. She covered her mouth with her small hands, but she couldn't hide her joy. Ninkei lifted the shorts and turned back to scold her angrily. What are you looking at? Killing is more interesting than this. Sang Sang put down her little hand and looked at him seriously. She replied, I will make a bowl of fat intestine noodles later. In summer it was the darkest and coolest time in Chang, and city before dawn. The residents who were forced to lie on the street by the hot night returned to their beds. They took advantage of this short period of coolness to have the most wonderful and deep sleep, trying to make up for all the time lost in the summer. No one slept in the old brush pen shop. Sang Sang made a bowl of fragrant noodle soup with a lot of chives, 6 or 7 pieces of fat intestine and 2 pieces of large intestine. Ninkei ate the noodle soup like a whirlwind. He wiped his mouth and put on a shabby ordinary outer shirt and a brand new ordinary bamboo hat. He covered most of his face with a mask and wrapped the padao and the big black umbrella with a coarse cloth. Then, he pushed open the back door of the small courtyard and walked into the night after saying goodbye to the little handmaiden. Walking through the quiet streets and alleys of the eastern city, the cool night wind passed through them. Whether it was the tired residents or the vigilant dogs, they were all sleeping sweetly. It seemed that the whole city had not woken up yet. Only the sound of the water delivery cart rolling over the bluestone could be heard from time to time, and then it gradually faded away. The faint light of the lantern illuminated the road ahead of the water delivery cart, which was swaying restlessly. When the water delivery cart passed by the side entrance of a marketplace in the southern city, Ninkei, who had been silently squatting in the gap of the big bucket, jumped down. His feet landed on the ground silently and his body quickly flashed into the darkness of the side alley of the marketplace. Then, he took out the hand-drawn map by Sang Sang and looked at it for the last time in the extremely dim light. Just as Sang Sang was puzzled, planning to kill a person every once in a while was totally incompatible with the quiet and bitter life of studying in the academy, and the noisy and annoying life in the marketplace on Lin 47th Street. Moreover, this kind of boring repetition was really boring. But for Ninkei, who had just returned to Chang, and from the city of Wei, eating a bowl of noodles with fat intestines or noodles with fried eggs from time to time, and then killing people for revenge was like writing a few pieces of calligraphy and meditating for a few hours. It had become a very important part of his life and even a kind of habit. Every time he killed a target for revenge, every time he erased a name on the oil paper list, he would feel that the burden on his shoulders was reduced, his body was relaxed, and the sticky blood on his hands was a little lighter. Everyone instinctively yearned for a relaxed and happy life, so his instinct urged him to continue doing it. Sang Sang had prepared the knife, the cloth mask, the coat, the bamboo hat, the map and the target's living habits and schedule. A little black-faced handmaiden walking through the streets of Chang, and would not attract anyone's attention. Ninkei was not worried about her safety, but trusted her ability. Therefore, every time he was about to unsheath his knife, he never thought that he would not be able to cut off a head, including today. When he quietly entered the marketplace under the cover of the night and walked toward the small lake behind the tea house, he had already begun to use that person's head as a sacrifice to the general's mansion and many people in the village. Today he was going to erase the third name on the oil paper list. The owner of that head was Yen Suqing, 41 years old, a former document appraiser of the military ministry. He was good at tea ceremony and seal appraisal. After being driven out of the military ministry by the imperial court with an excuse, He became a tea master specially hired by a famous tea merchant in Chang'an. According to Zhua Er's investigation, the irrefutable evidence that Xianwei general was accused of treason and colluding with the enemy was personally appraised by this person, and it was even possible that the 3 letters were forged by this person. This person also had a lot of unclear connections with the massacre of the village in the Yan territory. When Xiao's army pointed at the Yan kingdom, but failed to arrive at the edge of Min Mountain, Yan Suqing was in Xiao's army. But it was puzzling why, as a document appraiser of the military ministry, he would appear on the frontline battlefield full of killing and blood. Yan Suqing was now living in a lakeside house purchased for him by a tea merchant. Ning Ke walked along the lakeside quietly, looking at the row of secluded houses on the lakeside getting closer and closer, as well as the bamboo walls and thatched cottages that seemed to be alienated but with a hint of antiquity. Ning Ke slowly raised his eyebrows outside the mask and suddenly felt something wrong. Because this lakeside house was too quiet and secluded. It was not easy to live in Chang'an. It could be said that every inch of land was worth its weight in gold. In the bustling city, the word quiet and secluded represented nobility, and it was very expensive. Ning Ke knew that Yan Suqing was deeply trusted and relied on by the tea merchant, but he believed that no matter how extravagant and generous a tycoon was, it was impossible for him to give such a lakeside house to his subordinate tea master. The morning light still hadn't arrived, and the view of the lakeside was still dark. Only the ripples of the water reflected the lights of some unknown houses, giving a faint light. Ning Ke walked to the front of the lakeside house, looking at the huge stone chair under the stone steps in the courtyard, and the emaciated middle-aged man sitting in the chair through the alienated bamboo wall. After a slight pause, he pushed the door and entered. A small oil lamp was lit, and the emaciated middle-aged man sat on the stone chair, holding a coarse big mud-made teacup in his left hand, and gently knocking the corner of the ebony tea table with his right hand. He calmly looked at the lad who pushed the door and entered, and a faint smile suddenly appeared on his thin cheeks, and then he said softly, "The so-called tea ceremony is actually to strengthen a certain sense of ceremony with a complicated process, so as to produce a sense of solemnity." Chapter 109. The lakeside house under the shade of the bamboo wall was quiet and dark. The middle-aged tea artist was sitting on a stone chair carved with Kuan Lake stone, and in front of him was a tea table carved with Kuan Lake stone, on which there was an ebony tea table, on which there were warm and clean teapots and teacups. Beside the table was a small portable charcoal stove, on which the kettle on the stove exuded faint steam, but it had not boiled yet. In such a hot summer night, the middle-aged tea artist seemed not to feel the heat brought by the small charcoal stove. He was draped in a thin coat, and was as calm as a hospitable host waiting for someone to return in a winter snowy night. He was Yan Suqing. Ning Ke was very sure of this. The vigilance he had before outside the lakeside house was finally confirmed at this moment, because the other party had sensed his coming in advance, and had already perceived his intention. Glancing at the tea dregs under the bamboo wall with the corner of his eyes, and after a moment of silence, he looked at the tea artist in the chair and asked, "Then let's be direct. I want to know whether you have anything to do with the extermination of the whole family of the Xianwei general's mansion, and the massacre of the Yan border village?" Yan Suqing slightly frowned. He did not expect that the lad who came to kill him tonight was actually because of the 2 things many years ago. He had thought that no one in the world remembered those old things. After a moment of silence he smiled and said, "Of course it has something to do with me. Otherwise how could I, an officer with a bright future in the military ministry, become a tea artist who looks after the house of a tea merchant? I should not be the first person you've come to." He looked at Ning Ke and asked, "How are the others now? I haven't seen them for many years. I don't know what they are doing now." Ning Ke silently observed the lakeside house and the movements around. Looking at this noble residence, he answered, "They are not living well, at least not as good as you, who can live in such a nice place." Yan Suqing laughed out, shook his head and said with emotion, "Do you know why they are all not doing well but I can live well? Because I am still of some use to the empire." The messy clothes on the body, the unboiled water on the small charcoal stove, and the empty teacup in his left hand all indicated that the tea specialist had just woken up. He probably got up because he sensed that Ning-Kei was near the lakeside house. He was not planning to ambush Ning-Kei in advance. He was just a tea artisan who looked weak and frail and dealt with tea sets and spring water all day long. Why didn't he call for help or run away when he knew that someone was coming to kill him? Instead, he just sat there calmly and waited? What could he rely on? Moreover, what use could a tea master have for the empire? It suddenly bounced up from the table and then turned into a dark trace of light, tearing the darkest night before dawn of the lakeside house and piercing the outside of the courtyard. Ning-Kei felt a prickling pain on his back, but there was no panic on his face, which was not covered by the mask. There was only calmness and calmness. Just as he was about to rush out of the sea of bamboos, he unexpectedly stomped on the ground with his left foot. His whole body turned over, and then his right foot stepped on the thick bamboo like lightning. Thump! 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 The solid soles of his shoes stepped on the bamboo rapidly, making the bamboo tree shake for a while, and countless bamboo leaves rustled down like broken feather arrows. He stepped on the bamboo tree and climbed to the courtyard wall in an instant, narrowly avoiding the sword light coming from the courtyard. Then he slightly bent his knees and quickly swept to the courtyard with the help of the vibration of the bamboo tree. With a bang, his body just swept over the courtyard wall like a sharp arrow, and the sharp padao had already been unsheathed in his hand. With a muffled groan, Ning-Kei exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, turned over his wrist, and then the padao chopped toward Yen Suching like a snowstorm. Since he knew that this tea specialist was a powerful cultivator, he knew that tonight he would inevitably face a terrible test of life and death again. He knew that his present strength was not enough to fight against a powerful cultivator in the cultivation world, but he still didn't think of retreating, because he knew that retreating in the face of a cultivator meant death. At the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, he saw how Peng Yutao and the most elite bodyguards of the Tang Empire fought with a great sword master with iron and blood, will and discipline. Outside Spring Breeze Pavilion, he saw how Cao Xiaoshu beheaded 2 foreign cultivators with his superb strength and strong control, from which he learned some experience that was, facing a cultivator, one could only advance and not retreat, and this experience might help him escape death. So at the beginning his retreat was not retreat, but retreat in order to advance, and then kill. Ding! A clear sound was heard. Ning-Kei twisted his body and waved his padao, chopping away the gray sword light that escaped behind him, and then his body fell from the air. For the first time they met, there was a rice grain-sized gap on the edge of the padao and a tiny tear on the top of his shabby robe. However, there was still no fear in his eyebrows and eyes outside the mask. His legs were firmly rooted on the ground like 2 nails, his hands tightly grasping the long hilt of the padao, and he slightly lowered his head to vigilantly observe the movement in the night. All of a sudden, he turned the long padao in his hand and avoided the sword light coming from the right side of the night at the cost of a blood mark on his left shoulder. At the same time, he confirmed from the slight vibration coming from his hand that his blade had at least scratched the flying sword. Ning-Kei still slightly lowered his head, quietly staring at Yen Suching sitting in a chair not far away, and carefully listening to the slight buzzing sound in the night around the lakeside house from time to time, trying to determine the position of the flying sword. He took a step forward. A falling bamboo leaf outside the courtyard was torn into 2 halves by an invisible force. He fell backward like a mountain, and the gray shadow of the sword brushed past his shoulder, but it missed its target. He heavily patted the ground with his right hand, tightened his waist and abdomen, and then stood up again like a mountain. His feet moved as fast as lightning, and the gray sword shadow plunged into the crack of the flagstone in front of his feet, and then quickly flew away again with a buzzing sound, disappearing without a trace. He now stood 3 steps back from the previous position. The small oil lamp on the right side of the tea table glowed faintly, and Yen Suching sat in a stone chair with a faint smile. The distance between the two was only a few steps, But it was so difficult to cross this distance in the night, because no one knew where the gray sword shadow was in the night. Holding the long padao hilt tightly with both hands, Ninkei steadily stepped on the flagstone without stepping on the crack or the protrusion to ensure that he could borrow all the strength of the earth at any time. Like a statue, Ninkei stared at the tea artist in the chair, with no fear in his eyes, only calmness and concentration. This was the first time in his life that he fought with a cultivator alone. He knew he had no chance and he was very likely to meet death tonight, so of course he was afraid. But Ninkei had been tortured by life and death too many times, so he was very clear that fear was the most useless emotion at this time. Only by turning fear and tension into excitement could he turn life and death around. The flying sword buzzed and stabbed at him like lightning. He waved his padao to cut it, and even if he missed, he would avoid the vital parts at the last moment by virtue of the fighting instinct honed on the battlefield and his extremely strong body control. Ding! 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 The sword was like flying light, and the padao was like snow. His body was cut with numerous dense wounds by the sword shadow, and the blood seeped through his shabby clothes and began to drip on the surface of his body, making him look like a bloody man. But Ninkei still held the padao tightly with both hands, and his feet were like nails on the flagstone. He stared at the powerhouse in the chair without any expression in his eyes, without panic or fear, and even without the fanaticism that should be in a desperate fight. A soldier coming back from the frontier fortress? Yen Suqing gradually stopped smiling, and looked at the bloody lad not far away from him, saying calmly, 14 consecutive sword attacks failed to directly stab you to death, and only left some small wounds on you. Only the frontier fortress soldiers have this kind of physical instinct. But I have to remind you that even if the wounds are small and the blood flow is slow, you will still die after a long time of bleeding. I understand, so I will try to find a chance to cut off your head before the blood runs dry. Ninkei answered. You won't have such a chance. Yen Suqing looked at Ninkei sympathetically and shook his head. At this time, the water on the small charcoal stove finally began to boil, and hot water mist sprayed from the mouth of the pot. The tea artist lifted the kettle on the stove with his left hand, and poured the water into the crude teacup. He looked at the tea leaves that kept floating in the boiling water, and lowered his head saying, I'm going to drink the morning tea so I won't play with you. There is one more chapter which is being written. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote monthly. Your support is my biggest motivation. At this moment he could only run towards death or run faster than death. Only in this way could he have the last shred of hope. When Ninkei was 2 steps away from Yen Suqing, he stared at his opponent's neck with his eyes wide open, regardless of the aura of death so close to him. Crossing his hands, he concentrated all his strength on the padao and fiercely chopped at Yen Suqing. Looking at the fierce blade light coming at his face, Yen Suqing held the teacup in his left hand and just touched his lips, with no expression on his face. In the sea of breath of nature, he clearly saw that the hiltless small sword controlled by his psyche power had already flown to the back of Ninkei like lightning. Before the blade fell, the lad would die. The padao in Ninkei's hand was 3 feet away from Yen Suqing's neck. Yen Suqing's flying sword was 1 foot away from Ninkei's back. The flying sword controlled by a cultivator was faster than the knife wielded by the best machete men in the world. No matter how he calculated, although Ninkei bravely fought for a desperate chance, it was a pity that this last fight could only cost his own life, but could not hurt Yen Suqing at all. The next moment Ninkei should have died, but he didn't. With the momentum of dragging the padao and chopping, he quietly loosened his left hand and very naturally reached to his back, grasping a hard object sticking out of the cloth. He grasped the handle of the big black umbrella. His slender and steady fingers grasped the handle of the umbrella and twisted it forcefully. The coarse cloth wrapped around the umbrella suddenly changed shape. The sturdy hard-woven cloth arched and tore in an instant, revealing a few patches of black inside. Those patches of black rotated and tore the cloth, like an ancient dragon that had been lying dormant for a long time, raising its head violently from the ground. More and more coarse cloth was torn apart, revealing more and more black. Gradually, the black patches formed a black umbrella surface. The surface of the black umbrella rotated and opened, and its surface area suddenly expanded. It was like a big black flower that was instantly stimulated by the condensed spring wind. With a bang, it covered Ninkei's back and blocked the dark sword shadow that was buzzing and shrill. Yin Suqing mobilized all his psyche power to make a fatal sword shadow with endless power. However, when the hiltless small sword fiercely stabbed the seemingly ordinary and greasy umbrella surface of the big black umbrella, a very unimaginable follow-up change took place. There was no sound of the umbrella surface tearing, nor was there any sound of fierce collision. When the incomparably sharp flying sword pierced the surface of the black umbrella, it was like a fallen leaf falling into a boundless black swamp, or like a tired mosquito gently landing on the black signboard of the old workshop. The flying sword, vibrating and buzzing at high speed, seemed to be glued to the big black umbrella surface, and suddenly became absolutely quiet. A moment later, the fallen leaf falling into the boundless black swamp slowly sank without a trace, and the tired mosquito falling on the old black plaque dispiritedly and powerlessly fell to the air, falling to the end of its life. The previously agile and sharp hiltless small sword seemed to have lost all its life in an instant, falling from the big black umbrella surface and slowly falling to the ground. In the world of the chi of heaven and earth, a thread was broken. Yin Suqing's expression suddenly changed, finding that he could not sense his own natal sword. With a shrill roar, he released the coarse teacup with his left hand and put his palms together to clamp the blade of Ninkei's one hand, chopping toward him. There was a hair's width between his palms and Ninkei's blade, and they did not completely touch each other. However, in that extremely fine space, there seemed to be some kind of power filling it as tight as cotton. The shrill roar reverberated in the quiet lakeside small house. Hearing the roar, the flying sword that had just fallen to the ground bounced for a while, but could not fly again no matter how hard it tried. It seemed to be extremely miserable and futile, like an old mosquito falling on the frosty ground in late autumn, with its thin wings frozen into glass ice. The so-called struggle was more like the twitching before death. Yin Suqing's eyes were full of killing intent. With another shrill roar, he crossed his palms to slap away the cold blade surface, and then his right hand came out of his sleeve. His body slanted and bounced up from the chair, and he used his fingers as a sword to stab Ninkei's throat. At this time, the coarse and clumsy teacup fell to the ground heavily, and the ground was covered with black and red ceramic gravel. The hot water mixed with tea leaves scattered in a radial shape, and the white-hot air escaped in a panic. Yin Suqing used his fingers as a sword to stab Ninkei's throat, and drew an arc slightly to the left, which was a little farther than the direct stab, which also gave Ninkei the last time to react at the critical moment. He had to do so because he wanted to avoid the big black umbrella behind Ningquebec. Subconsciously, he did not want to touch the big black umbrella, even a little bit. The greasy and dirty surface of the opened big black umbrella looked darker and darker than the darkness before dawn in the lakeside small house. Yin Suqing did not know what the big black umbrella was. But as a swordmaster who had been immersed in the cultivation world for many years and had made progress in the past 10 years after he quit the military ministry and hid among the tea-scented clay pottery, he could vaguely feel the fear brought to him by the big black umbrella, which was the instinctive fear of cultivators. It was because of the deepest fear in his heart that Yin Suqing's finger sword was a little slower than usual. It was also in this extremely short time that Ninkei had time to move the black umbrella to the left side of his body. At this time, the big black umbrella, which had been completely opened, had a large surface area. Like a big black flower floating on the lake, it obediently slid from Ninkei's right shoulder to his left shoulder, and then covered his entire body. Yin Suqing's fingers poked on the surface of the big black umbrella fiercely. The feeling of poking on the surface of the black umbrella was a little slippery, sticky, and disgusting. Yin Suqing stared at the place where his fingertips touched the surface of the black umbrella. The deep fear in his heart surged out, his body trembled violently, and his face became extremely pale in an instant. He was extremely shocked to find that the psyche power in his body, and the chi of heaven and earth mobilized by his psyche power were also surging out along with the inner fear. The big black umbrella was like the deepest and most boundless night, which would swallow all the light. Yen Suqing didn't expect that he would be forced into such a situation by an ordinary person and a seemingly ordinary big black umbrella. But he knew that he had been forced to the edge of the cliff of life and death. He didn't withdraw his finger sword, because as soon as the light entered the night, the winner must be decided. It was either day or night. Before or after sunrise and sunset, no one could leave in advance. A shrill and unpleasant howl burst out from his lips. The cultivator who had hidden among the people for more than 10 years finally broke out the most extreme strength. He exerted his psyche power at a terrifying speed and dispersed it around his body through the snow mountain and ocean of chi. He mobilized all the chi of heaven and earth that could be sensed in the lakeside small building, condensed it in front of his fingers, and turned it into sword style to stab the black umbrella. The overbearing and sharp sword power of the cultivator was transmitted from the surface of the big black umbrella to the handle, and then to Ning Kei's hand holding the handle. He lowered his head and stabilized the black umbrella with his left hand and shoulder blade. Listening to the cracking sound coming from his wrist bone and feeling the terrible power borne by his body, he clenched his teeth and didn't retreat. At this time, he was like a Tang soldier with the big black umbrella as a shield and a knife behind him, standing in the forefront of the decisive battle on the grassland, desperately resisting the violent attack of the barbarian tribes outside the shield. He couldn't retreat, for once he retreated, he would be defeated. Everyone from the frontier army of the Tang Empire had such a sense of discipline and courage. At this time, he concentrated all his spirit and strength on the handle of the umbrella to contend against Yen Suqing's finger sword, which was condensed with his lifelong cultivation. Besides, he faintly felt that something very precious in his body was constantly flowing away along the umbrella handle and into the surface of the big black umbrella. So he couldn't lift the padao behind him with his right hand at all. With his finger on the umbrella and his body inside, the deadly stalemate lasted for a long time. The chi of heaven and earth surged in the lakeside small building and condensed in front of Yen Suqing's finger, turning into a very short and sharp sword intent that stabbed fiercely. Whether it was the dancing bamboo leaves or the gradually cooling water mist, they all seemed to feel the tense atmosphere in the field. Yen Qingsu snorted slightly, and the blue veins on his pale face appeared and then disappeared. The big black umbrella retreated a little. The umbrella handle slipped away from Ning Kei's left hand and hit his head hard. Finally, a trace of the extremely sharp sword style succeeded in penetrating the surface of the big black umbrella and pierced in from the point where the handle collided. With a puff, blood spurted out from Ning Kei's mouth and nose, spreading along the edge of the mask and dyeing his tender face red. On the other side of the black umbrella, Yen Suqing's eyes also began to drip blood, and the light in his eyes gradually dimmed. He had squeezed out too much psyche power and was almost exhausted. Now it all depended on who could hold on longer. The handle of the big black umbrella pressed on Ning Kei's chest like a mountain, and blood kept gushing out from his mouth and nose. The mask had been completely soaked with blood, and the blood kept dripping along the edge of the mask and onto his shoes. He raised his head with great difficulty, and his listless eyes brushed the edge of the black umbrella, looking at the tea master outside the umbrella. He found that Yen Suqing's thin cheeks had become even thinner at this time, and his eyes were deeply sunken. It seemed that he couldn't hold on much longer. All of a sudden, Ning Kei felt the power coming from the umbrella handle weakened a little. He suddenly raised his head, holding the umbrella handle tightly with his left hand, and pushing against the handle with his chest, he forced himself to take a step forward. The big black umbrella was like an indestructible big shield, pushing Yen Suqing back a step. A fierce howl of grassland beasts fighting brutally came out of the youth's mouth. He mobilized the last trace of strength in his body, lifted the padao dragged on the ground, and fiercely chopped at Yen Suqing. With a crack, the blade deeply penetrated into the depths of Yen Suqing's neck, and then continued to move forward with an extremely horrible sound of bones breaking and flesh breaking, until it came out from the other side. The pair of eyes on Yen Suqing's head stared at the teenager behind the black umbrella in disbelief. Then, his head tilted and fell from his neck, bounced twice on the ground, and rolled into the tea that was still giving off steam. The big black umbrella slowly fell down, and the umbrella handle was still tightly held in Ninkei's hand. Ninkei stared at the head on the ground, gasping rapidly, and said, "You're used to being a tea master, so you're no longer a sword master, because you even forgot to invite a valet." The darkness before dawn was so deep, and Chang'an was so quiet at this time. There were no pedestrians on the streets, not even a cat that was used to walking at night. A youth covered in blood ran out of a square in Southern City. He staggered and ran, and sometimes his weak legs couldn't support him, so he fell heavily on the ground. Blood kept dripping from the edge of the mask. He felt that his sight was a little blurred, and even his mind was a little confused. He didn't know where he was because of excessive blood loss or other reasons. "If I want to take your life, I will definitely take your life," he subconsciously murmured, looking for the way home. The voice came out of the mask that was soaked and stuck with blood, and seemed a little distorted. He had heard the siren before, and the remaining reason made him know that he had to leave here as soon as possible. The government had been alarmed, and if Chang'an City sent out the Yulin Royal Guards, he would only have a dead end. So he continued to run wildly on the Vermilion Bird Avenue that he didn't recognize. The black umbrella tied to his back was bounced up from time to time, and then opened puff after puff. The vengeful youth covered in blood. The evil ghost that crawled back from the underworld. A black lotus grew on his back. "I've written for 10 hours and I'm finally satisfied with writing to this point. F***CK. I'm not going to write a single chapter. By the way, I need everyone's recommendation and support on Monday. I didn't want to ask for monthly votes, but this chapter is so good that I feel sorry for myself if I don't take this opportunity to ask for monthly votes. Good night. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters after I wake up, and I'll make sure to write the best 3 chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.